I am Desdemona, but everyone in my circle calls me Desi. I am 65 years old, a retired forensic auditor for the federal government, and a woman who does not tolerate disrespect from anyone. At breakfast this morning, my 28-year-old daughter-in-law, Chloe, threw a cup of scalding coffee right at my chest. Her reason was simple. I refused to hand over my exclusive black credit card so she could fund a luxury spa day for herself and her mother. She stood in the middle of the kitchen screaming that I had exactly 4 hours to pack my bags and get out of her house. What she did not know was that I actually owned the house down to the very last light bulb. By the time she returned, she would be walking into a very expensive, echoing, empty box. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not demanded, and if you have ever had to teach an entitled person a harsh lesson in reality. Growing up, my mother taught me that blood makes you related, but respect makes you family. I spent 40 years of my life tracking down tax evaders, money launderers, and financial fraudsters for the federal government. I have sat across interrogation tables from hardened criminals who tried to intimidate me, so a pampered lifestyle influencer like Chloe throwing a temper tantrum was not going to make me flinch. It was a typical Tuesday morning in the affluent suburb where my son Marcus and his wife lived. I had come to stay with them for a few days to recover after a minor knee surgery. The kitchen was a pristine marvel of white marble countertops and stainless steel appliances, all of which I had paid for out of my own pocket. I was sitting at the island quietly sipping my herbal tea and reading the morning financial news on my tablet. I was wearing my favorite ivory silk blouse, a retirement gift I had bought for myself to celebrate 4 decades of hard work. Chloe breezed into the kitchen wearing a designer tracksuit. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled for whatever social media video she planned to film that day to pretend her life was perfect. She did not say good morning. She did not ask how my knee was recovering. Instead, she marched right up to where I was sitting, slammed her perfectly manicured hand on the marble counter, and demanded my credit card. Marcus, my 33-year-old son, was sitting right across from me. He was wearing his expensive business suit, eating a bowl of oatmeal before heading to his corporate office. He did not even look up when his wife demanded my money. I looked at Chloe and asked her why she needed my card. She rolled her eyes and scoffed loudly, acting as if I had asked the most ridiculous question in the world. She told me she and her mother Susan were going to a luxury wellness retreat downtown, and she needed to put a $5,000 deposit down for their weekend package. I looked at her calmly, took a sip of my tea, and simply said no. I told her my bank account was not a charity fund for her mother, and that if she wanted a luxury spa day, she should use the money from her own supposedly successful influencer career. That was when the mask completely slipped. Chloe's face turned a violent shade of red. The passive-aggressive smiles vanished. She grabbed the heavy ceramic mug of freshly brewed dark roast coffee sitting on the counter next to her. Without a single second of hesitation, she hurled the contents directly at me. The scalding liquid hit my chest, soaking instantly into my ivory silk blouse and searing my skin. The sudden burning sensation was intense. The hot coffee soaked through to my skin, staining the beautiful fabric brown. But I did not scream. I did not jump up. I did not curse at her. I simply closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, absorbing the physical shock, and then opened them to look dead into her eyes. The kitchen fell completely silent. The only sound was the dripping of hot coffee falling from the hem of my blouse onto the pristine hardwood floor. I looked over at Marcus, my own flesh and blood. The boy I had raised as a single mother working 60-hour weeks to put him through college so he would never have to struggle. He finally looked up from his oatmeal, saw his mother dripping in hot coffee, and quickly averted his eyes back to his bowl. He said absolutely nothing. He did not defend me. He did not jump up to grab a towel. He did not reprimand his wife for physically assaulting his mother. He just sat there swimming in his own cowardice. Chloe felt completely empowered by his silence. She leaned over the counter, pointing a shaking finger just an inch from my face. "Listen to me, you arrogant old woman," she hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. I am sick of your attitude. I am sick of you acting like you are better than my family just because you have some money stashed away. You are in my house now. Marcus is my husband. I am the lady of this house, not you. Take your ghetto attitude somewhere else." She grabbed her designer purse from the chair and slung it over her shoulder. "I am leaving for 4 hours," she announced, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am going to brunch with my mother, and then we are going shopping. When I get back here at 2 o'clock, you better have that black card sitting on this counter waiting for me. If you do not, I want your bags packed and I want you out of my house. If you are still here without that card, I will call the police and have you dragged out of my home for trespassing." She turned on her heel and stormed out of the kitchen. A moment later, I heard the heavy oak front door slam shut, followed by the roar of her luxury SUV engine starting in the driveway. A car, I might add, that I had co-signed for because her credit score was an absolute disaster. The silence in the kitchen returned heavy and suffocating. I slowly reached for a linen napkin and began dabbing at the ruined silk of my blouse. The burn on my chest was painful, but the deep ache in my heart from watching my son was far worse. Marcus finally pushed his bowl away. He let out a long, dramatic sigh, acting as if he were the true victim of the morning. "Mom, why do you always have to provoke her?" he whined, rubbing his temples. "You know how stressed she has been lately with her social media engagement dropping. Could you not just give her the card to keep the peace? You have more than enough money in the bank. It is just a few $1,000s. I stopped dabbing at my shirt. I looked at my son, truly looking at him for the first time in years. I saw a weak, spineless man who would rather see his mother humiliated and physically assaulted than face the wrath of his entitled wife. "It is her house." Mom Marcus continued, completely oblivious to the cold realization washing over my face. "We need to respect her boundaries. Please just leave the card on the counter before she gets back. I have to go to work. I have a big presentation today and I cannot deal with this toxic drama." He grabbed his briefcase, refused to meet my eyes, and walked out the door to his car. I sat alone in the massive, quiet house. My chest stung, my favorite shirt was ruined, and my son had just broken my heart. But the sadness quickly evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The exact kind of clarity that made me the most feared auditor in my division. Let me give you some context about this house. When Marcus proposed to Chloe 3 years ago, he came to me begging for a loan for a down payment. He said Chloe's parents were wealthy and expected their daughter to live in a very specific, expensive zip code. I knew her parents, Richard and Susan. They were the kind of people who smiled at you in public, but locked their car doors when you walked past them on the street. I also knew from a quick look at public financial records that they were swimming in massive debt. I did not trust Chloe, and I certainly did not trust her family. So instead of giving Marcus cash, I bought this house through a limited liability company that I entirely owned and controlled. I let them live here rent-free. I furnished it. I bought the appliances. I did it to protect my son from a woman I knew would eventually ruin him. Marcus's name was nowhere on the deed. He was merely a permitted tenant living in a fantasy world I had financed. Chloe thought she held all the cards. She thought because she had a diamond ring on her finger and her name on the mailbox, she was untouchable. She thought she could abuse me, disrespect my culture, and demand my hard-earned wealth while threatening to throw me out onto the street. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name of my nephew, Malik. Malik was a shark of a real estate and trust lawyer and the only person in the family who shared my ruthless pragmatism. He picked up on the second ring. "Aunt Desi," he said, his voice bright and professional. "What can I do for you this morning?" "Malik," I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any emotion. "I need you to contact the removal team, the heavy-duty one we used for the Peterson estate last year." There was a brief pause on the line. Malik knew exactly what that meant. "The full crew, Auntie," he asked, his tone shifting into serious business mode. "Yes," I replied, standing up from the bar stool and looking around the beautifully furnished living room. I looked at the plush velvet sofas, the crystal chandelier, the 85-inch flat-screen television, the expensive Persian rugs. I paid for all of it. Every single spoon in the drawer, every towel in the bathroom, every piece of art on the wall. "I want the clean sweep package," Malik, I instructed, walking into the grand hallway. "I want every piece of furniture, every appliance, every light bulb, and every single roll of toilet paper removed from this property. I want it stripped down to the bare drywall, and I need it done in exactly 3.5 hours." "Consider it done," Malik said, a hint of dark amusement entering his voice. "Should I draft the emergency eviction notices as well?" "Have them ready by this afternoon," I said. "Chloe wants me out of her house. It is time she learns who actually owns the floor she stands on." I hung up the phone. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly walked upstairs, changed my ruined blouse, and began packing my single overnight bag. The countdown had officially started. Chloe had demanded I leave my things or get out. I decided I would just take everything. I stood in the grand foyer of the house with my overnight bag resting quietly by my feet. The silence of the morning was shattered exactly 35 minutes later by the deep rumbling of 3 massive moving trucks turning onto the pristine street. The neighborhood where Marcus and Chloe lived was the kind of place where people hired professional landscapers just to trim their hedges with literal rulers to ensure absolute perfection. The sight of 3 industrial-sized moving trucks parking on the manicured street immediately caused the curtains of neighboring houses to twitch. I walked to the heavy oak front door and swung it open. A crew of 12 burly men stepped out of the trucks. Leading them was a tall, broad-shouldered man named Tyson. I had used Tyson and his crew for complex estate liquidations during my time as a forensic auditor for the federal government. He knew my extremely high standards, and he knew I did not play games when it came to business. Tyson walked up the driveway holding a heavy clipboard in his strong hands. "Good morning, Miss Desi," he said, looking respectfully at the coffee stains still visible on the edge of my collar, despite me changing my shirt upstairs. He raised a slight eyebrow, but he knew far better than to ask what had happened. "I told you we needed the absolute complete clean sweep package," I said with my voice echoing slightly in the grand entrance hallway. Tyson nodded deeply and handed me the clipboard. Before they could touch a single item inside the property, I had to provide the proper legal authorization. I pulled a thick leather folder from my large tote bag. Inside the folder were the articles of incorporation for a limited liability company I had formed 3 entire years ago. The company was called Ironclad Holdings, and I was the sole proprietor and managing director of the entire entity. Attached to the corporate documents was the original deed to this exact property. This was the ultimate secret Marcus and Chloe did not know. When Marcus begged me for a massive down payment, crying that he would lose the woman of his dreams if he could not provide a luxury lifestyle, I made a highly calculated decision. I did not give him a single dime in cash. Instead, my corporate entity purchased this $1.5 million property entirely in cash. I allowed Marcus and Chloe to live here on a $0 lease agreement. They paid for absolutely nothing except their own groceries, and Chloe endless online shopping habits. Every single piece of furniture, every high-end appliance, every piece of custom art on the walls, and every thick rug on the floor was purchased solely with my corporate bank account. I handed Tyson the heavy stack of receipts, which I had meticulously organized in a black binder. "The company owns the property, and the company owns all the contents," I explained calmly. "I want everything removed immediately." Tyson flipped through the thick binder with his eyes widening slightly at the sheer volume of luxury items listed on the pages. "You mean absolutely everything, Miss Desi?" he asked, just to be absolutely sure there was no misunderstanding. "Everything," I confirmed with a cold and steady voice. "If it is not bolted securely to the concrete foundation, it goes into your trucks right now. And frankly, if my money bought the metal bolts, you need to take those too." Tyson turned to his large moving crew, blew a sharp metal whistle, and the coordinated invasion began immediately. It was a beautiful symphony of calculated destruction. 4 strong men immediately tackled the massive living room. Chloe had practically demanded custom white velvet sofas that cost more than a highly reliable used car. I watched, without a single ounce of regret, as the men wrapped the expensive velvet in thick protective plastic and hoisted the massive sofas onto their broad shoulders. They rolled up the beautiful hand-woven Persian rugs that I had personally imported from Turkey years ago. They carefully unmounted the huge 85-inch flat-screen television from the wall, leaving behind nothing but 4 empty screw holes in the pristine white drywall. The living room, which had been her absolute favorite backdrop for her entirely fabricated social media life, was reduced to a cavernous, echoing void within 20 short minutes. I walked directly into the kitchen, which was the exact scene of the crime from just an hour ago. 2 men were already disconnecting the massive stainless steel smart refrigerator. Chloe loved that expensive refrigerator because it had a built-in touchscreen she used to leave passive-aggressive notes for my son. The movers carefully wheeled it out the front door on a heavy-duty metal dolly. Another mover was rapidly emptying the custom glass cabinets. I watched silently as he packed away the fragile bone china plates, the delicate crystal wine glasses, and the heavy ceramic coffee mugs. He even packed the exact dark mug she had used to hurl the scalding hot coffee directly at my chest. I made sure he wrapped it incredibly carefully. I wanted every single trace of my financial support completely erased from this entire room. They took the designer Italian espresso machine, the expensive stand mixer she used exactly 1 time for a sponsored video, and even the shiny silver-plated utensils from the deep wooden drawers. The rapid dismantling process quickly moved upstairs. I followed Tyson directly into the massive master bedroom. This was the specific sanctuary Marcus and Chloe truly believed was their personal kingdom. The absolute centerpiece was a massive luxury bed with an intricately carved dark mahogany frame and a mattress that cost as much as a college tuition payment. The men broke down the heavy wooden frame piece by piece. They stripped the imported white Egyptian cotton sheets and packed them securely away. They took the 2 matching mahogany dressers, the full-length lighted vanity, where Chloe spent hours doing her daily makeup, and the soft velvet ottoman resting at the foot of the bed. They strategically left the clothes. I had absolutely no interest in stealing their personal garments. The designer dresses, the expensive tailored suits my son bought to impress his corporate coworkers, and the countless pairs of shoes were unceremoniously dumped in a massive, messy pile in the exact center of the bare hardwood floor. It looked like a luxury clothing boutique had suddenly exploded in the room. The entire process was brutal, highly efficient, and deeply satisfying to my soul. As the hours slowly ticked by, the entire house was stripped completely bare. But I did not stop at the major furniture pieces. I told Tyson I wanted a true clean sweep, and my personal definition of clean was entirely forensic. I instructed the moving crew to take down the incredibly expensive silk curtains I had custom ordered for the formal dining room. I had them carefully unscrew the glowing crystal chandeliers from the dining and living room ceilings, leaving only the bare electrical wires hanging from the dark holes. They went into the 4 bathrooms and removed the plush white towels, the luxury bath mats, and the decorative shower curtains. Then we got what some people might consider petty. But to my mind, it was not petty at all. It was deeply principled. I walked through the empty house with a cardboard box, systematically removing every single glass light bulb from every single lamp and overhead fixture that was not hardwired securely into the ceiling. If my hard-earned money bought the illumination, they could sit in the absolute dark. I went into all the bathrooms and removed the white toilet paper rolls from the metal dispensers. I took the scented hand soap from the sinks. I took the expensive laundry detergent from the utility room shelves. I took the designer metal trash cans. By the time the 4th hour finally approached, the entire house looked exactly as it had the day the original builder handed me the shiny keys. It was a $1.5 million completely empty shell. Standing in the absolute middle of the vacant living room, the acoustics of the house had completely changed. Every single footstep echoed loudly against the walls. Every breath sounded heavy and amplified. The grand, luxurious home was now just cold drywall, bare hardwood, and echoing emptiness. The comfortable fantasy was officially over. I felt a profound sense of closure washing over my mind. For years I had quietly enabled my son. I had convinced myself that by providing him with a beautiful home and a soft cushion of wealth, I was being a good and loving mother. I thought I was protecting him from the harsh realities of the unforgiving world. But all I had truly done was fund his personal weakness and subsidize a cruel woman who openly despised me. I realized that specific morning, with the sting of the hot coffee, still a phantom pain resting on my chest, that true love sometimes requires utter devastation. Marcus needed to fall down hard. He needed to hit the absolute rock bottom so he could finally realize that a man is not measured by the square footage of his house or the expensive brand of his wife. He is measured entirely by his integrity, his strong spine, and his willingness to stand up for the people who truly love him. He had failed that important test miserably today, and his wife needed to learn that extreme entitlement is a dangerous game when you are playing with someone else's money. She thought she was the undisputed queen of the castle, but she was about to discover she was just an unwelcome squatter in a kingdom she did not build. Tyson walked up to me with his heavy boots echoing loudly in the completely empty space. "That is the very last of it, Miss Desi," he reported, while wiping sweat from his forehead. "The moving trucks are fully loaded and secured tightly. We are heading directly to the climate-controlled storage facility you secured earlier this week." "Thank you, Tyson," I said calmly, handing him a thick envelope containing a very generous cash tip for him and his entire hardworking crew. "You boys did absolutely excellent work here today. Please make sure to securely lock the doors on your way out." I picked up my small overnight bag, which was the only physical thing remaining in the entire house. I walked out the heavy front door and stepped into the bright midday sun. The 3 moving trucks rumbled to loud life and began their slow, heavy procession out of the quiet neighborhood. The incredibly nosy neighbors had finally come out onto their green porches, whispering frantically to each other, trying to piece together the scandalous daytime drama unfolding right in front of them. I ignored them all completely. I walked to my car, a sensible but pristine dark sedan, and placed my bag gently in the passenger seat. I turned around and looked at the house one last time. From the outside, it still looked like a picture-perfect, beautiful suburban dream. The red brick facade was flawless, the green lawn was perfectly manicured, and the bright flowers in the garden boxes were blooming beautifully, but I knew the absolute truth. The inside was a hollow, dark, empty void, much like the marriage it had been sheltering for 3 years. I got into my car, started the quiet engine, and pulled smoothly out of the wide driveway. I did not look back in the rearview mirror once. I drove confidently toward the luxury hotel downtown, where I had booked a beautiful suite for the next 2 full weeks. I needed a hot shower, a fresh cup of herbal tea, and a comfortable place to sit while I watched the inevitable explosion happen from afar. Exactly 10 minutes after I pulled safely onto the busy highway, the silence in my car was interrupted. My phone resting in the center console cup holder buzzed sharply. I glanced down at the bright screen. It was an automatic notification from the security camera installed right at the front door of the house. The live preview image popped up instantly on my screen. It showed Chloe with her blonde hair slightly windblown, holding a massive shopping bag from a high-end luxury boutique. She was standing confidently on the front porch, digging frantically through her expensive designer purse for her house keys, completely unaware that the key she was about to turn would open the door to a terrifying, cold reality. I smiled a genuine, deeply relaxed smile and continued driving toward the city. I watched the entire scene unfold live from the security camera mounted directly above the heavy oak front door. The camera lens offered a perfect wide-angle view of the pristine driveway and the grand entrance of the house. It was 2:00 in the afternoon when Chloe pulled into the driveway in her expensive sports utility vehicle. She parked haphazardly, leaving the front tires slightly angled onto the manicured green grass. She stepped out of the vehicle, looking incredibly pleased with herself. She was holding a massive iced coffee in one hand and 3 large shopping bags from high-end designer boutiques in the other. Her blonde hair bounced as she walked confidently up the stone pathway. She looked like a woman who believed she had completely conquered the world. She reached the front door and struggled for a moment to find her keys while balancing the heavy shopping bags. She finally retrieved the shiny silver key and pushed it into the lock. She pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside the house. Because the interior security cameras were hardwired into the ceiling, they were still completely active. I switched my view to the grand foyer camera to watch the exact moment her entire reality shattered into a million tiny pieces. She stepped onto the bare hardwood floor and casually kicked the door shut behind her. She did not look up immediately. She was busy rearranging the shopping bags on her arm. Then she finally lifted her head. The bags slipped from her hands. The heavy paper bags hit the bare floor with a loud slap. The camera captured her perfectly manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth. She stood completely frozen in the entryway for what felt like an eternity. The grand living room, which had been filled with custom velvet sofas and imported rugs, was now just a massive cavern of empty white space. She took one slow step forward. Her high heels struck the hardwood floor, and the sharp clicking sound echoed loudly, bouncing off the bare walls and the high ceiling. Click, click, click. The sound was incredibly hollow. She began to walk faster, her breathing growing visibly heavier on the video feed. She ran into the kitchen where she had thrown the scalding hot coffee at my chest just hours earlier. The massive stainless steel refrigerator was gone. The designer espresso machine was gone. The custom bar stools were gone. She spun around in a frantic circle, her blonde hair whipping across her face. She ran toward the formal dining room and looked up at the ceiling where the glowing crystal chandelier used to hang. There were only bare electrical wires sticking out of the small dark hole in the drywall. She let out a piercing scream. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated panic. She grabbed her phone from her pocket with shaking hands. Her chest heaved up and down as she frantically dialed a number and pressed the phone tightly against her ear. She began pacing back and forth across the empty living room floor, the sound of her heels creating a frantic, chaotic rhythm in the hollow house. I could not hear the audio of the phone call from the hallway camera, but I could easily imagine the sheer hysteria in her voice. Marcus was sitting in his corporate office downtown, likely preparing for the big presentation he had mentioned that morning. He probably answered the phone expecting to hear his wife complaining about a rude store clerk or demanding more money for her shopping spree. Instead, he heard the panicked screaming of a woman who believed she had been the victim of the most efficient robbery in suburban history. On the camera feed, I watched Chloe waving her arms wildly in the air, pointing at the empty corners of the room, as if Marcus could somehow see what she was seeing through the phone. She ran her hands through her perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive blowout she had just received at the luxury salon. She was pacing so fast, she practically tripped over her own feet. She ran upstairs quickly, and the camera feed followed her. The camera caught her sprinting into the master bedroom. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the massive pile of their expensive clothing dumped unceremoniously in the absolute center of the bare floor. The custom mahogany bed, the heavy dressers, the full-length lighted vanity, all completely vanished. She collapsed onto her knees right next to the pile of clothes and began sobbing uncontrollably. The camera captured every single tear. She was experiencing the exact same absolute loss of control she had tried to force upon me earlier that morning. She thought she could simply command me to leave and threaten me with the police. Now she was sitting on the floor of an empty house, crying into a pile of expensive suits and designer dresses. It took Marcus exactly 22 minutes to break every traffic law to reach the house. He threw his car into park right behind her luxury vehicle, leaving his door wide open as he sprinted up the stone pathway. He burst through the front door, his expensive tie loosened, and his chest heaving from the exertion. He stopped dead in the entryway, exactly where Chloe had stopped. His briefcase dropped from his hand and hit the floor with a loud thud. Chloe heard the noise and came running frantically down the wooden stairs. She threw herself into his arms, sobbing hysterically and pointing at the empty walls. "Look what they did!" she screamed, her voice echoing loudly down the staircase. "We have been completely robbed, Marcus. They took absolutely everything. They even took the toilet paper from the bathrooms. We need to call the police right now. They took my custom velvet sofas. They took the television. They took the rugs." Marcus slowly pushed her away. He did not look angry at the invisible thieves. He looked absolutely terrified. He walked slowly into the center of the living room, his eyes scanning the empty corners, the bare windows, and the completely empty kitchen beyond. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He knew immediately this was not a random neighborhood robbery. Random thieves do not unscrew light bulbs from the ceiling. Random thieves do not remove custom shower curtains and fold them neatly before stealing them. Random thieves do not leave a massive pile of expensive designer clothing untouched on the floor of the master bedroom. He knew exactly who had done this. He remembered the cold, steady look in my eyes when he walked out the door that morning, leaving me dripping in scalding hot coffee. He remembered telling me it was her house and I needed to respect her boundaries. He slowly raised his hands and rubbed his temples, closing his eyes as the crushing weight of his own profound stupidity settled heavily onto his shoulders. Chloe was not paying any attention to the terrified realization on her husband's face. She was too busy dialing the emergency number on her phone, demanding immediate police assistance. She yelled at the dispatcher, claiming they had been targeted by a highly organized criminal syndicate. She demanded they send officers immediately to recover her stolen luxury property. Marcus stood silently in the middle of the empty room, his shoulders completely slumped, staring blankly at the bare white walls. I sat comfortably in my luxury hotel suite downtown, sipping a fresh cup of hot tea, watching the sequence unfold online. The timing was perfect. I finished my tea, picked up my handbag, and walked down to the hotel parking garage. I slid into the driver's seat of my sedan and drove back toward the neighborhood. As I turned onto their quiet street, I saw the flashing lights of 2 police cruisers parked in front of the house. 3 uniformed officers were walking up the driveway. Chloe was standing on the porch, waving her arms frantically and yelling at the officers to hurry. Marcus was standing right behind her, looking like a man walking to his own funeral. I pulled my car to the curb, shifted into park, opened my door, and stepped out onto the street. The sound of my door shutting drew their immediate attention. The officers turned to look at me. Marcus closed his eyes and let out a defeated breath. Chloe locked her eyes onto me, and her face twisted into pure, unhinged rage. She pushed past the officers and ran down the front steps, her heels clicking aggressively against the concrete. She raised a shaking finger and pointed it directly at my face. "Arrest that black woman right now," she screamed, pointing frantically between me and the empty house. "She broke into my home and stole absolutely everything from my house. Arrest her." I stood perfectly still. I did not raise my voice or react to her screaming. The police officers looked confused, glancing between the hysterical young woman and the calm older woman standing confidently on the street. Marcus finally moved. He slowly walked down the concrete steps, looking completely broken. He grabbed Chloe by the arm and tried to pull her back toward the empty porch. "Stop it, Chloe," he whispered, his voice cracking with utter humiliation. "Stop screaming at her." The officers stepped forward, their hands resting near their radios, asking for everyone to calm down and explain the situation clearly. I smiled and pulled the legal folder from my handbag, ready to end her world. I sat in my car, watching the chaotic scene unfold on the manicured lawn of the property I owned entirely. Chloe was standing there in her expensive designer tracksuit, pointing a shaking finger at me while screaming at the 2 police officers. She demanded that they arrest me immediately for breaking and entering and for stealing all her luxurious furniture. The older police officer, a tall white man with a stern expression, placed his hand resting heavily on his utility belt right next to his handcuffs. He began walking slowly down the driveway toward my vehicle. Marcus stood frozen on the porch, completely incapable of intervening or telling the truth. He looked like a frightened child, waiting for his mother to fix a mess he had created. I did not flinch as the officer approached my window. I simply rolled down the glass and offered him a polite, respectful smile. Before the officer could ask for my identification or demand I step out of the vehicle, the passenger side door of my car opened smoothly. My nephew Malik stepped out onto the clean concrete driveway. Malik was dressed in a sharp, custom-tailored navy blue suit, holding a thick leather briefcase. He walked around the front of my car with the confident stride of a man who spent his entire career tearing apart opposing counsel in high-stakes courtrooms. He stepped directly between me and the approaching police officer. "Good afternoon, Officer Malik," said, his voice carrying a calm, authoritative tone that immediately commanded respect. "I am the legal counsel for this woman who is the sole legal owner of the property you are currently standing on." The police officer stopped in his tracks, looking slightly confused. He glanced back at Chloe, who was still screaming about her stolen custom velvet sofas, and then looked back at Malik. Chloe ran down the driveway, her blonde hair flying wildly behind her. "Do not listen to him!" she yelled, her face red with pure, unhinged anger. "That woman is my mother-in-law, and she just robbed my house blind. I want her in handcuffs right now." The officer held up a hand to silence her and turned his attention back to Malik. He asked to see some proof to back up this very bold claim. Malik calmly opened his leather briefcase and pulled out the thick folder we had prepared exactly for this moment. "Here are the articles of incorporation for Ironclad Holdings," Malik said, handing the first stack of papers to the officer. "This limited liability company is solely owned by my client, Desdemona Washington. Below that, you will find the original deed to this property officially registered entirely under the company name. You will clearly see that neither Marcus Washington nor his wife Chloe have any legal ownership of this estate. They are simply permitted guests who have been living here on a $0 month-to-month informal arrangement." The police officer took the heavy stack of papers and began reading through them carefully. His stern expression slowly morphed into one of complete understanding. He read through the deed and the corporate filings, verifying the seals and the signatures. Chloe was practically hyperventilating next to him as she watched the dynamic of the situation shift entirely out of her favor. "That is a lie," she screamed, stomping her foot on the concrete like a spoiled toddler. "My husband bought this house for us. Tell them, Marcus. Tell them you own this house." She turned around to look at Marcus, who had finally slowly walked down the driveway. Marcus could not even look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the concrete and shook his head slowly. "It is her house, Chloe," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. "She bought it. We never owned it." Chloe staggered backward as if she had been physically struck by a heavy blow. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. Her entire fabricated reality was crumbling down around her, in front of the authorities she had summoned to destroy me. "But my things," she stammered, her voice losing its aggressive edge and replacing it with pure desperation. "She took all my furniture and my television and my appliances. My expensive clothing is just sitting on the bare floor." Malik reached into his folder again and pulled out the massive stack of receipts I had provided to the moving company earlier that morning. "Actually, Mom," Malik corrected her smoothly while handing the extensive financial records to the police officer. "My client purchased every single piece of furniture, every appliance, and every decorative item inside that structure. Here are the credit card statements and original store receipts proving that Ironclad Holdings funded the entire interior decoration down to the absolute last spoon in the kitchen drawer. My client simply decided to relocate her corporate assets to a climate-controlled storage facility today. She did not steal anything because you fundamentally cannot steal what you already legally own." The officer spent a long time reviewing the receipts, matching the names and the dates and the item descriptions. He looked at the massive total amount spent on the velvet sofas and the imported rugs. He finally sighed heavily and handed the thick stack of documents back to Malik. He turned to face Chloe, who was now trembling uncontrollably, holding her designer purse against her chest like a protective shield. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice completely devoid of the sympathy she had been expecting just moments ago, "I have reviewed all the legal documents and the purchase receipts provided by this attorney. This is entirely a civil matter, and there has been no crime committed here today. In fact, since this woman owns the property and you have no formal lease agreement, you are technically trespassing on her estate right now if she decides she no longer wants you here." Chloe let out a loud gasp, clutching her chest as if she could not breathe the suburban air. "You cannot do this to me!" she cried, looking frantically between the police officer and me, sitting calmly in my vehicle. "I live here. This is my home. We are married, and this is our marital home." The officer shook his head firmly, completely unfazed by her tears. "No, Mom, it is not," he replied with absolute finality. "Unless you have a signed lease agreement or your name on a legal deed, you have absolutely no legal standing here. The property belongs to her company. If she asks you to leave and you refuse to vacate the premises, we will have to arrest you and escort you off the property for criminal trespassing." The officer tipped his hat politely to me and Malik before turning back toward his parked cruiser. "We are leaving now," he told his younger partner, who had been standing silently near the street. "There is no robbery here, just messy family business. Have a good afternoon, folks." The two officers got into their vehicles, started the engines, and slowly drove away down the quiet street, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence behind them. Malik closed his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut. He gave Marcus a look of profound disappointment and absolute disgust before walking around the car and getting back into the passenger seat. I kept my window rolled down, simply watching the two of them standing alone in the wide driveway of my completely empty house. Marcus looked absolutely defeated. He had lost his dignity, his comfortable home, and the respect of his mother, all in one single disastrous morning. He turned around and slowly walked back toward the empty house, his shoulders slumped heavily without saying a single word of comfort to his frantic wife. Chloe was left standing entirely alone on the concrete driveway. Her entire false reality, her carefully curated social media persona, and her unearned wealthy lifestyle had just been dismantled piece by piece in front of the authorities she had foolishly tried to weaponize against me. She looked at her luxury car, she looked at the empty house, and then she looked directly at me. The sheer panic in her blue eyes slowly evaporated and was quickly replaced by a dark, violent, unpredictable rage. She finally realized she had absolutely no power, no money, and no control over the situation or over me. I did not say a single word to her. I did not need to gloat or offer any final words of advice. My total silence and my calm, relaxed demeanor were far more devastating than any insult I could have possibly thrown at her. I slowly reached over to the center console of my car and picked up my smartphone. I subtly angled the camera lens directly toward her and pressed the red record button, making sure the screen was hidden from her view. Chloe suddenly let out a primal, screaming wail of pure, frustrated anger. She marched aggressively over to the open garage door, where Marcus kept his expensive sports equipment lined up against the wall. She reached into his heavy leather golf bag and pulled out a solid metal golf club. Her face was twisted into an incredibly ugly mask of pure, unadulterated hatred and entitlement. She marched directly up to the large custom window of the front living room. She raised the heavy metal club high above her blonde head and swung it forward with all the frantic physical strength she could possibly muster. The metal head of this club struck the thick decorative glass with a deafening, terrifying crash. The expensive custom window shattered instantly, sending hundreds of sharp glass shards raining down onto the front concrete porch and scattering across the empty hardwood floor inside the house. She swung the club again and then again, screaming completely incoherently with every single violent strike. She completely destroyed the beautiful front window frame, leaving a jagged, dangerous gaping hole in the front of my pristine property. Marcus ran out of the front door, yelling frantically at her to stop, but she was completely out of control, lost in a violent temper tantrum. She pushed him away aggressively and swung the heavy club at a large, decorative ceramic planter near the entrance, smashing it into a dozen dusty pieces across the walkway. I sat comfortably in my car, recording every single second of her violent, destructive meltdown in crisp, high-definition video. She thought she was hurting me by destroying the physical house, but all she was really doing was handing me the exact legal weapon I needed to destroy her future completely. The video captured her face, her violent actions, and the undeniable digital proof of her felony criminal vandalism. When she finally dropped the golf club onto the grass, completely exhausted and panting heavily, I simply smiled. A genuine smile pressed stop on my recording, shifted my car into drive, and drove smoothly away, leaving them alone with the broken glass. I sat in the driver's seat of my dark sedan, with the engine quietly idling, while the shattered glass from the beautiful custom living room window sparkled like crushed ice across the pristine concrete driveway. The loud crashing sound of the heavy metal golf club striking the thick decorative glass had finally faded, leaving a heavy and uncomfortable silence lingering over the affluent suburban neighborhood. Chloe had exhausted herself completely from her violent temper tantrum and was now sitting on the lush green grass of the front lawn, sobbing into her hands, with her designer tracksuit covered in fine white dust and tiny glass shards. She looked nothing like the confident, arrogant lifestyle influencer who had thrown scalding hot coffee at my chest just a few hours earlier. She looked entirely defeated. Marcus stood near the damaged front porch for a long moment, staring blankly at the jagged edges of the broken window frame. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire fabricated reality burn completely to the ground. Slowly, he turned his body and began walking down the driveway toward my parked car. His shoulders were slumped heavily and his expensive silk tie was hanging loosely around his neck. He dragged his feet across the concrete, crushing the small pieces of broken glass beneath his polished leather dress shoes. He approached the open passenger side window of my vehicle and leaned down, resting his hands weakly against the door frame. His eyes were red and filled with a desperate, pleading energy that instantly reminded me of the times he used to beg for expensive toys when he was just a little boy. He swallowed hard and asked me to please stop this entire situation right now. He begged me to call Tyson and the moving crew and order them to bring all the luxury furniture and the expensive appliances back to the house. He promised me that he would personally pay for the broken window and that he would force Chloe to apologize for throwing the hot coffee at me. He tried to rationalize her incredibly violent behavior by claiming she was just under a tremendous amount of stress from her social media career and that she did not truly mean to cause any physical harm or property damage. He told me that we were a family and that families are supposed to forgive each other and stick together during difficult times. I sat perfectly still, listening to my 33-year-old son, desperately trying to defend a woman who had shown absolutely zero respect for my humanity or my property. I did not feel any anger at that specific moment. I only felt a profound, overwhelming sense of disappointment. I looked at Marcus and told him that his definition of family was severely flawed. I explained that family does not assault each other over credit cards, and family certainly does not destroy a $1.5 million home in a fit of entitled rage. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up a crisp yellow manila envelope that my attorney, Malik, had carefully prepared earlier that morning. I handed the envelope through the open window and told Marcus to read the documents inside very carefully. His hands were shaking slightly as he pulled back the metal clasp and slid the thick stack of legal papers out into the afternoon sunlight. The bold black letters printed firmly at the very top of the first page clearly stated that this was a formal 3-day emergency notice of eviction. I watched his eyes scan the legal jargon, detailing the immediate termination of his $0 month-to-month tenancy agreement. The document explicitly cited the malicious destruction of private property and hostile behavior as the primary legal grounds for the expedited eviction process. Marcus looked up from the papers with an expression of pure disbelief. He asked me how I could possibly do something so incredibly cruel to my own flesh and blood. He reminded me that he had a massive corporate presentation to prepare for and that he could not possibly pack up his entire life and find a new place to live in just 3 days. He told me that I was ruining his life and purposely destroying his marriage just because I wanted to prove a point. He completely ignored the fact that his wife had assaulted me and vandalized my home. Instead, he chose to make himself the absolute victim of the entire situation. I kept my voice incredibly calm and steady as I told him that I was not ruining his life, but rather I was simply removing my financial support from his completely unsustainable lifestyle. I told him that he was a grown man who needed to take full responsibility for the woman he chose to marry and the massive mess they had collectively created. I told him he had exactly 72 hours to gather his clothing and personal items and vacate the premises permanently. If he and Chloe were still inside the property after the deadline expired, I assured him that Malik would have the local sheriff department physically remove them for criminal trespassing. That was the exact moment Marcus made his final choice. The desperate pleading energy completely vanished from his eyes and was instantly replaced by a dark, resentful anger. He stood up straight and threw the legal documents back through the open window of my car, scattering the papers across the passenger seat. He pointed his finger at me and raised his voice, echoing the exact same toxic behavior his wife had displayed earlier. He called me a cold-hearted, vindictive mother who cared more about money and control than her own son. He declared proudly that he chose his wife over me and that he would rather live in a cardboard box on the side of the street than ever accept another single dime of my toxic money. He told me I was dead to him. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. If he truly wanted to be completely independent from my financial resources, I decided it was time to grant his wish immediately and comprehensively. I reached into my large leather tote bag and pulled out my tablet computer. I unlocked the screen and opened the mobile application for my premium cellular service provider. I had been paying for his unlimited data plan and his expensive smartphone installments for the past 10 years because it was simply convenient. I calmly navigated to the account management dashboard, selected his specific phone number from the active lines, and pressed the bright red button to permanently disconnect the service. Marcus was still standing outside my car, yelling about how he and Chloe were going to build their own wealthy empire without my help. He confidently pulled his phone from his pocket, intending to call his friends to help them pack their belongings. I watched his face closely as he tapped the screen. He swiped his finger a few times, looking completely confused. The small signal bars in the top corner of his screen had completely vanished, replaced by a stark message indicating he had absolutely no cellular service. He looked down at his dead phone and then slowly looked back up at me with a sudden realization dawning in his eyes. I did not stop there. I closed the cellular provider application and opened the secure portal for my comprehensive health insurance network. I had kept Marcus on my premium executive health plan for years, utilizing a special corporate extension clause through my holding company. I navigated to the dependent coverage section and systematically removed his name and the name of his wife from the active policy. I pressed confirm and immediately severed their access to top-tier medical care, dental benefits, and prescription coverage. I looked directly into his eyes and informed him that his phone was now completely disconnected and his health insurance was officially terminated effective immediately. I told him that since he was now a fully independent man who chose to stand beside a woman who violently destroyed my property, he no longer needed his cold-hearted mother to subsidize his daily existence. I suggested he use the wireless internet inside the empty house while it was still active to research affordable short-term housing options because my service provider would be shutting down the router at midnight. The sheer panic returned to his face as the crushing reality of true financial independence finally hit him. He had absolutely no savings, no functioning phone, no insurance, and only 3 days to find a place to live. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Before he could attempt to backpedal and apologize, my own phone began to ring from its place in the center console. The loud, ringing tone cut sharply through the tense silence between us. I glanced down at the bright screen and saw the caller identification displaying the name Richard Kensington. It was the father of Chloe calling, the man who was secretly drowning in massive debt while pretending to be a wealthy suburban aristocrat. I knew exactly why he was calling. Chloe had undoubtedly used his phone or an internet connection to run crying to her parents about the mean older woman who took away her expensive toys. I picked up the phone and pressed the green button to accept the call, bringing the device slowly to my ear. I did not even get a chance to say hello before the aggressive voice of Richard came booming through the speaker, loud enough for Marcus to hear clearly from outside the car. Richard was absolutely furious. He bypassed any polite introductions and immediately launched into a vicious tirade filled with incredibly offensive microaggressions and blatant classist insults. He told me that I had picked the wrong family to mess with. He told me that people like me did not know how to behave in polite, high-class society, and that my actions today were completely unacceptable. He sneered into the phone and promised me that he was going to use all of his powerful connections to absolutely ruin my life. He said he was going to hire the most expensive, ruthless lawyers in the entire state to sue me for everything I owned and make sure I ended up completely bankrupt. His voice dripped with pure condescension as he delivered his final threat, telling me that he was going to send me right back to the ghetto where I belonged. I sat quietly in my luxury car, listening to the hollow threats of a desperate broke man, completely unaware that he had just handed a retired federal forensic auditor the perfect motivation to investigate his entire fraudulent life. I rolled up my tinted window smoothly, cutting off Marcus mid-sentence as he finally found his voice to complain again. I did not look back at him or the shattered glass covering my pristine driveway. I drove slowly down the manicured suburban street, leaving them both behind in the devastating reality of their own making. Richard thought he could intimidate me with racist threats and legal bluffs. He fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. He thought he was protecting his spoiled daughter, but all he had truly done was paint a massive federal target directly onto his own back. I was going to enjoy tearing his fraudulent empire apart, piece by incredibly satisfying piece. I settled into my spacious suite at the luxury hotel downtown and poured myself a fresh cup of chamomile tea. The heavy silence of the room was a welcome contrast to the chaotic screaming I had left behind in the suburban driveway. However, I knew the silence would not last very long. Chloe was a creature of the digital age, and her entire sense of self-worth was directly tied to the validation she received from strangers on the internet. When she realized that throwing a temper tantrum in the real world could not force me to surrender my wealth, she immediately retreated to the one place where she still had complete control over the narrative. She went to social media. By the time the sun began to set that evening, my phone was vibrating continuously with incoming notifications from friends and family members who were absolutely horrified by what they were seeing online. Chloe had posted a highly edited and deeply manipulative video to her social media accounts. She sat on the bare hardwood floor of the empty living room, intentionally positioning herself so the camera captured the vast, echoing emptiness of the house I had just cleared out. She looked completely disheveled. Her blonde hair, which was normally styled to absolute perfection, was deliberately messy and pushed away from her face to highlight her tear-stained cheeks. She stared directly into the camera lens and began to cry crocodile tears that would have won her a major acting award. She told her hundreds of thousands of followers a completely fabricated story about a cruel, abusive mother-in-law who hated her simply because she was a white woman marrying into an affluent black family. She completely omitted the part where she threw scalding hot coffee on my chest and demanded my credit card. She conveniently left out the detail that the house was legally owned by my corporate entity and that neither she nor my son had ever paid a single dime toward the mortgage or the utilities. Instead, she painted herself as a devoted young wife who had just been violently thrown out onto the street by a vindictive, evil old woman who wanted to destroy her marriage out of pure spite and jealousy. She spoke with a trembling voice describing how she and my son were now completely homeless with nowhere to sleep and no money to buy basic necessities because I had maliciously frozen all their accounts. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation and playing the ultimate victim. But she did not just want sympathy from her audience. She wanted cash. At the very end of the emotional video, she directed her followers to a crowdfunding campaign she had quickly set up. The campaign was titled, "Help a Young Family Survive a Toxic and Abusive Mother-in-Law." She set the initial fundraising goal at $20,000, claiming they needed the money immediately to secure emergency housing and replace the basic clothing and furniture I had supposedly stolen from them. Within the first 2 hours, the video had already amassed millions of views, and the donations began pouring in like a massive digital avalanche. The viral nature of the video brought an immediate and intense wave of backlash crashing down around me. My phone rang constantly with calls from concerned members of my church congregation. Sister Beatrice, who had known me for over 20 years, left a deeply disappointed voicemail asking how I could possibly be so cruel to my own son and his young wife. The women from my weekly Bible study group sent me long messages quoting scripture about forgiveness and the sanctity of family, urging me to apologize and return the furniture before I completely destroyed my reputation in the community. People I had helped financially in the past suddenly turned against me entirely based on a 3-minute video filled with blatant lies. Even a few of my former colleagues from the federal government reached out to ask if I was experiencing some kind of mental breakdown. The public humiliation was swift and severe. Chloe had successfully weaponized her digital audience to launch a targeted harassment campaign against me. She had orchestrated an absolute character assassination designed to make me bend to her will and give her back the luxurious life she felt she was owed. Most people facing that kind of overwhelming public pressure would have panicked. They would have rushed to post their own video explaining the truth, defending their character, and begging the public for understanding. They would have released the security footage of Chloe smashing the custom window with a golf club just to clear their own name. But I am not most people. I spent 40 years building incredibly complex legal cases against some of the most dangerous and deceptive financial criminals in the country. I learned a very long time ago that when your enemy is in the middle of making a massive, catastrophic mistake, you do not interrupt them. You simply step back and allow them to dig their own grave as deep as possible. So I turned off the notifications on my phone. I did not respond to a single angry message from my church friends. I did not issue a public statement, and I absolutely did not defend myself. I embraced the absolute silence and let the internet continue its outrage. I knew that the louder they screamed today, the harder they would fall tomorrow when the actual legal truth was finally revealed to the world. I sat in my comfortable hotel suite and simply watched the numbers on her crowdfunding campaign climb higher and higher. She hit her initial goal of $20,000 before midnight. By the next morning, the campaign had crossed $40,000. She posted several tearful update videos thanking her generous followers and promising that the money would help them rebuild their shattered lives. She played the part of the grateful victim flawlessly, and the internet rewarded her deception with an endless stream of cash. Every time a new donation rolled in, my phone screen illuminated in the dark room, but I felt no anger. By the afternoon of the second day, the total amount raised had reached a staggering $60,000. Chloe was undoubtedly celebrating her victory, believing she had successfully outsmarted me and secured a massive payday in the process. She thought she had won the war through public sympathy. She had absolutely no idea that she was walking blindly into a federal trap that she had constructed entirely by herself, with her own greed as the foundation. Raising money under false pretenses across state lines using the internet is not just a simple lie. It is a serious federal crime known as wire fraud. By soliciting donations based on a completely fabricated story of theft and homelessness, Chloe was not just being petty. She was committing a felony. And she was doing it completely out in the open, leaving a massive digital trail of evidence behind her. The $60,000 sitting in that campaign account was not a victory prize. It was the exact amount of rope she needed to hang herself completely. I knew the platform would eventually disperse those funds into a registered bank account, and I needed to know exactly whose bank account was receiving that stolen money. I suspected that Chloe was not acting entirely alone. Given the massive debt her parents were hiding, I had a strong feeling that her father, Richard, was somehow involved in managing the financial logistics of this sudden windfall. They were a family of grifters, and grifters always leave a sloppy trail of breadcrumbs when they think nobody is watching them closely. I walked over to the heavy mahogany desk in the corner of my hotel suite and opened my secure laptop. During my long career at the Federal Tax Agency, I had developed and utilized highly specialized tracking software designed to trace illicit funds through complex digital networks. When I retired, I retained access to several secure databases and analytical tools as a consulting expert. It was time to put those tools to work on a very personal case. I opened the encrypted program and stared at the blinking cursor on the dark screen. The room was completely silent, except for the rhythmic tapping of my fingers across the keyboard. I bypassed the public interface of the crowdfunding website and initiated a deep trace on the routing numbers associated with the campaign withdrawal settings. I typed the complex commands, watching the green text cascade down the monitor as the system began to connect the hidden dots of the financial transaction. I was going to follow every single penny of that $60,000, and I was going to see exactly where my entitled daughter-in-law was hiding her fraudulent fortune. I would completely expose their entire corrupt network to the harsh light of the federal justice system. The hotel room was bathed in the soft glow of my laptop screen. The city lights of downtown reflected against the large glass windows. but my entire focus was locked onto the cascading lines of financial data scrolling rapidly across my monitor. I took a slow sip of my chamomile tea, letting the warm liquid soothe my throat as I prepared to dismantle the financial illusions of Richard Kensington and his entitled daughter. When you spend 4 decades working as a forensic auditor, you develop a very specific set of skills. You learn how to look past the superficial numbers and see the hidden narratives buried deep within the banking routing codes. Money always tells a story, and unlike people, money never lies. Chloe thought she was incredibly clever by crying on the internet and collecting $60,000 from sympathetic strangers. She thought the digital world offered her a shield of anonymity. She was entirely wrong. Every single transaction leaves a digital fingerprint, and I possessed the exact tools required to trace those prints all the way to their ultimate destination. I bypassed the standard public interface of the crowdfunding website and utilized a specialized tracking protocol I maintained access to as a federal consulting expert. The system hummed quietly as it pinged the secure servers, tracing the withdrawal requests Chloe had initiated just a few hours earlier. I watched the screen intently as the funds began to move. The $60,000 did not simply transfer into a standard personal checking account under her name or even a joint account she shared with my son Marcus. Instead, the money was instantly fragmented into 3 smaller transactions deliberately designed to avoid immediate bank reporting thresholds. That specific maneuver is a classic money laundering technique known as smurfing. Seeing it executed so flawlessly confirmed my deepest suspicions. Chloe was not the mastermind behind this financial operation. She was far too careless and impulsive to construct a structured digital transfer system. Someone else was pulling the strings behind the scenes. The fragmented funds were rapidly routed through 2 intermediary online payment processors before finally consolidating into a single commercial banking account. I typed a series of secure commands to identify the specific owner of that ultimate destination account. The database paused for a brief moment before displaying the registered corporate information. The account belonged to a limited liability company called Kensington Global Logistics. I leaned back in my chair and let out a soft, humorless laugh. Kensington Global Logistics was nothing more than a shell company. I recognized the incredibly generic corporate structure immediately. It was registered to a small commercial mailbox at a strip mall just outside the city limits. There were no actual logistics being handled, no warehouses, no shipping trucks, and absolutely no legitimate business operations. It was nothing more than a hollow paper entity designed specifically to move dirty money. And the registered owner of this completely fraudulent enterprise was none other than Richard Kensington. The same man who had called my phone earlier that day, screaming racist insults and threatening to send me back to the ghetto. The man who portrayed himself as a wealthy, sophisticated suburban aristocrat was actually using his own daughter to run a pathetic internet scam just to inject cash into his failing shell company. But as an auditor, you never stop at the first layer of deception. You always keep digging until you hit the absolute bottom of the pit. I opened a new search window and began pulling the comprehensive financial records for Richard and his various business ventures. What I quickly found was a truly spectacular disaster of staggering proportions. Richard was completely drowning in massive, insurmountable debt. He had multiple defaulted loans, unpaid business credit lines, and several outstanding judgments from angry investors he had previously defrauded. His primary legitimate consulting business had gone completely bankrupt 3 years ago, which coincidentally was the exact same time Marcus had come begging me for a down payment on a luxury house. Richard had been bleeding money for years, trying desperately to maintain the outward appearance of extreme wealth, while his actual financial reality was collapsing around him. He drove leased luxury cars he could not afford and lived in a heavily mortgaged mansion that was weeks away from foreclosure. As I continued to sift through the digital wreckage of his life, I found something that made my blood run completely cold. I opened the corporate officer filings for Kensington Global Logistics to see who else was authorized to sign the fraudulent bank transfers. They're listed directly beneath Richard as the primary executive director was the name Marcus Washington. He was my very own only son. I stared at his name on the bright screen, feeling a sharp, painful ache expanding in my chest. Marcus was not just a naive fool who married a toxic woman. He was actively participating in a federal financial crime. I quickly pulled the historical records for the shell company and pieced together the entire tragic timeline. Richard had appointed Marcus as the executive director 2 years ago. Because Marcus had a completely clean financial background and a solid corporate salary, Richard used his clean credit profile to open new lines of credit and secure fraudulent business loans under the shell company name. Richard was using my son as a human shield. Whenever the debts became overwhelming or the creditors started asking aggressive questions, all the legal liability would fall directly onto the registered director. Marcus was a puppet, dancing on strings pulled by a desperate grifter. I realized with absolute clarity why Marcus had been so terrified and compliant when Chloe threw the hot coffee at me. He was completely trapped. He was legally tied to a massive financial fraud scheme, and he knew that if he ever stood up to his wife or her father, they could easily throw him under the bus and let him take the fall for all their corporate crimes. He had traded his dignity, his independence, and his relationship with his mother just to buy the temporary illusion of a wealthy lifestyle. He had sold his soul to a family of criminals who viewed him as nothing more than a convenient, disposable asset. A weaker mother might have broken down and cried. A weaker mother might have immediately called her son to warn him about the impending danger, begging him to run away before the authorities found out. But I was not a weak woman, and I certainly was not going to protect a grown man from the consequences of his own greedy decisions. Marcus had made his choice when he looked at me covered in scalding coffee and told me to just give his wife my credit card. He made his choice when he threw the eviction notice in my face and declared that he would rather live in the streets than accept my guidance. I had spent my entire life trying to protect him from the harsh realities of the world, and the result was a weak, cowardly man who allowed himself to be manipulated into committing federal crimes. The only way he would ever learn to stand on his own 2 feet was if I allowed the entire corrupt structure he had built to collapse completely on top of him. I spent the next 2 hours downloading every piece of evidence I could find. I saved the routing numbers, the fragmented transaction logs, the fraudulent loan applications, and the corporate registry documents showing Marcus and Richard as co-conspirators. I compiled the digital files into an encrypted dossier. I documented exactly how the $60,000 from the crowdfunding campaign moved directly from the sympathetic donors' internet accounts right into Richard's fraudulent corporate bank account. It was an airtight case of wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. It was the kind of comprehensive financial evidence that federal prosecutors dream about finding. I closed the final database window and safely ejected the encrypted drive from my laptop. The city outside my hotel window was dark and quiet, but my mind was completely wide awake and focused. I walked over to the small table near the window and picked up my cell phone. I scrolled past the dozens of angry messages from my church friends and the frantic missed calls from relatives who had watched Chloe crying on the internet. I did not care about their misplaced outrage. They were crying over a fabricated story while I was holding the absolute truth in the palm of my hand. I found the specific contact number I had been looking for and pressed the screen to initiate the call. The phone rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. It was Special Agent Thomas Vance. "Hello, Desi," he said, sounding slightly tired but alert. I smiled, a slow, calculating smile. "Thomas," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "I have got a big fish for you. Bring the tactical team." The 72-hour deadline arrived with the heavy finality of a judge bringing down a wooden gavel. I sat in my quiet hotel suite, watching the digital clock on my bedside table click over to exactly noon. My lawyer, Malik, had already dispatched the local sheriff deputies to my property to ensure the eviction notice was fully enforced. I did not even need to be there to witness their humiliating departure. Through the security camera feed on my tablet, I watched Marcus and Chloe drag their suitcases down the pristine concrete driveway. They looked completely exhausted and utterly defeated. The reality of their situation had finally set in. They could no longer hide behind the beautiful brick facade of $1 million home. The neighbors they had spent years trying to impress were standing on their porches, watching the young affluent couple being escorted off the premises by armed law enforcement officers. Chloe was crying again, but this time there was no camera to capture her performance and no sympathetic audience to send her money. She climbed into her luxury vehicle, while Marcus loaded the last heavy bags into the trunk of his own car. They drove away from the empty house, leaving behind nothing but the shattered glass of the living room window and the broken pieces of their fabricated reality. I closed the video application on my tablet and took a deep breath of relief. The physical extraction was finally complete, but the financial devastation was only just beginning to unfold across the city. Marcus thought the worst part of his week was losing his comfortable home, but he was entirely unaware that the federal trap I had set for him was about to snap completely shut right in the middle of his busy workday. Marcus was sitting in his corner office at the downtown corporate headquarters of his financial management firm. He had always been incredibly proud of his prestigious job title and the expensive tailored suits he wore to project an image of absolute authority and success. He spent his entire morning trying to compartmentalize the massive disaster of his personal life, pretending that everything was completely normal. He smiled at his colleagues in the hallway and drank his expensive artisan coffee while aggressively ignoring the reality that he was now technically homeless. He believed he still had a secret safety net. He had a substantial corporate savings account that he had kept completely hidden from everyone, including me. He planned to use those funds to secure a long-term luxury suite at a high-end residential hotel until the entire situation blew over. He assumed he could easily buy his way out of the consequences of his extreme cowardice. The corporate office was a quiet environment filled with the soft clicking of keyboards and the hushed tones of important business negotiations. It was an environment built entirely on professional discretion and sophisticated behavior. That quiet atmosphere was violently shattered when the heavy glass doors of the reception area were thrown open. Chloe marched past the protesting security guards and the completely shocked receptionist. She was wearing her designer sunglasses indoors and carrying her large, expensive handbag. She did not care about professional etiquette or the embarrassed stares of the corporate executives standing near the water cooler. She was a woman incredibly desperate for her next injection of unearned wealth, and she had run entirely out of patience. Chloe barged directly into the glass-walled office of my son and slammed the door shut so hard the window blinds rattled against the frame. Marcus jumped out of his expensive leather office chair, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He practically begged her to lower her voice, reminding her that the managing partners of the firm were working directly across the hallway. Chloe completely ignored his desperate pleas for discretion. She leaned heavily over his mahogany desk and demanded that he immediately transfer $50,000 from his hidden savings account into her personal checking account. She told him that she refused to sleep in a cheap motel and that she had already contacted a luxury real estate agent to secure a high-end penthouse apartment downtown. She claimed that since I had ruined her life, he owed her the immediate financial resources to restore her lifestyle. Marcus tried to calm her down, reaching out to hold her hands, but she slapped his hands away aggressively. She yelled loudly enough for the entire administrative floor to hear every single word. She demanded he open his laptop right that very second and process the wire transfer. Marcus was completely humiliated. His co-workers were openly staring through the glass walls of his office, watching the supposed successful executive being verbally abused and commanded like a disobedient child. He knew he had absolutely no choice but to comply with her demands to make her stop screaming. He sat down heavily in his expensive chair, opened his secure banking application on his computer screen, and navigated to his personal savings portal. Marcus typed his secure password with shaking fingers, while Chloe stood directly behind his shoulder, monitoring his every move. He selected the transfer option and inputted the large dollar amount she had aggressively demanded. He clicked the final button to authorize the transaction, expecting to see the familiar green confirmation screen. Instead, a bright red error message immediately populated the center of his monitor. The message stated that the transaction was universally declined and that the entire account balance had been indefinitely frozen by a federal mandate. Marcus blinked his eyes rapidly, believing he had simply made a typing mistake. He refreshed the web page and tried to access his primary checking account. The exact same red error message appeared. He tried to check his corporate credit lines, but every single financial portal returned the identical, terrifying result. Every penny to his name was completely locked behind a federal wall. Chloe saw the bright red error messages and lost her mind entirely. She instantly started screaming that he was deliberately hiding his money from her. Marcus was hyperventilating, staring at the screen in pure, absolute terror. Before he could even attempt to call his bank, the heavy glass door of his office swung open again. His direct supervisor, a stern older man named Harrison, walked into the room, accompanied by 2 large corporate security guards. Harrison did not look angry. He looked completely disgusted. He asked Chloe to step away from the desk and looked directly down at Marcus. Harrison informed my son that the Corporate Compliance Division had just received an emergency notification from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He stated very clearly that Marcus was currently the primary subject of an active federal money laundering and wire fraud investigation linked to a corporate shell company. Because Marcus worked in the highly regulated financial sector, any association with federal fraud resulted in immediate catastrophic consequences. Harrison demanded that Marcus hand over his corporate access badge, and his company issued mobile phone right that very second. He informed Marcus that his employment was officially terminated with absolute immediate effect, and that the firm would be cooperating fully with the federal authorities. Chloe gasped loudly, finally realizing that her husband was now completely unemployed and entirely broke. Marcus sat in his chair completely paralyzed as the security guards stepped forward to escort him out of the building. While my son was being humiliatingly marched out of his prestigious corporate office building, carrying his personal belongings in a small cardboard box, his father-in-law was enjoying a beautiful sunny afternoon completely across town. Richard Kensington, the architect of the entire fraudulent shell company scheme, was playing a leisurely round of golf at his exclusive private country club. He was wearing his expensive white polo shirt and laughing loudly with his wealthy business associates, completely unaware that the walls of his elaborate financial prison were rapidly closing in around him. He stepped up to the perfectly manicured green lining up a crucial putt that he had just bet $1,000 on. He bent his knees, adjusting his expensive putter, and completely focused his eyes on the small white ball. He never even saw the 3 dark vehicles pull silently onto the paved cart path just behind the 14th hole. 3 men wearing dark sunglasses and navy blue windbreakers with bold yellow letters printed across the back walked directly onto the grass. They did not care about golf course etiquette or the shocked gasps of the wealthy country club members standing nearby. One of the men stepped right directly into the line of sight, blocking the hole completely. Richard stood up angrily, ready to yell at the man for interrupting his expensive game. Before he could utter a single arrogant word, the man pulled a heavy gold badge from his pocket and flashed it directly in the bright sunlight while reaching for a heavy pair of metal handcuffs to end his game permanently. The news of Richard being arrested spread through the city incredibly fast. For Marcus, it was the absolute worst day of his entire life, but for Chloe, it was the total destruction of her entire identity. They had checked into a cheap roadside motel on the outskirts of town. Because it was the only place that would accept the emergency prepaid debit card, Marcus had managed to scrounge up from his desk drawer before the security guards escorted him out of his corporate office building. The motel room smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach cleaning chemicals. It had a flickering fluorescent light buzzing loudly above the small bathroom mirror, and the carpet felt damp beneath their feet. For a woman who had just spent the morning demanding a luxury downtown penthouse apartment, this dingy room was a fate worse than physical torture. But the motel room was only the beginning of her absolute nightmare. While Marcus sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper, Chloe was frantically pacing across the stained carpet. Her phone had been blowing up with text messages from her mother Susan about the terrifying federal raid. Susan was completely hysterical, screaming that federal agents had raided their mansion and hauled Richard away in handcuffs right off the manicured green of the country club golf course. The federal agents had seized all of their computers, their financial records, and even the expensive luxury vehicles sitting in their driveway. When Chloe heard that her father was facing federal indictments for wire fraud and money laundering, the final remaining thread of her fabricated reality completely snapped. She turned slowly to look at my son sitting defeated on the bed, and all the false affection completely evaporated from her eyes. She did not see a husband who was suffering alongside her. She saw a useless broken machine that had permanently stopped dispensing cash. Chloe realized in that specific moment that Marcus had absolutely no power, no prestige, and no hidden safety net to catch her. She marched over to the cheap plastic dresser where Marcus had placed his cardboard box of office belongings and his small overnight bag. Without saying a single word, she grabbed his expensive tailored suit jacket and hurled it forcefully toward the flimsy wooden door of the dirty motel room, screaming at him with absolute venom. Marcus jumped up from the mattress, completely shocked by her sudden violent outburst, asking her what she was doing. Chloe did not answer him immediately. She simply grabbed his shirts, his expensive leather dress shoes, and his silk ties, and began throwing them violently across the small room. She screamed at him with a voice filled with pure venom and absolute hatred. She told him he was a pathetic, worthless loser who could not even protect his own wife from his vindictive mother. She grabbed his small suitcase, unzipped it aggressively, and threw the entire contents out the open door. She threw his clothing into the exterior hallway of the motel. Marcus ran to the door trying to stop her, trying to reason with a woman who had completely lost her mind, but she pushed him hard in the chest. She told him to get his hands off her and demanded that he get out of her sight. She said she refused to spend another single second in a disgusting, cheap motel room with a man who allowed himself to be fired and publicly humiliated. Marcus stood in the open doorway looking at his expensive corporate clothing scattered everywhere outside. He pleaded with her, telling her that they needed to stick together and figure out a legal strategy to unfreeze his bank accounts. He reminded her that they were married and that they had taken vows to support each other during the worst possible times. Chloe let out a loud, sharp laugh that echoed down the empty motel corridor. She looked him directly in the eyes and delivered the most devastating blow she could possibly muster. She told him she was filing for divorce first thing in the morning and that she was going to make sure he paid dearly. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger at his chest and laid out her completely delusional demands. She told him she was going to hire the most ruthless divorce attorney in the city, and she was going to legally force the sale of the $1.5 million house. Even after the police officer had explicitly explained the corporate ownership structure just a few days prior, Chloe stubbornly refused to believe the truth. She was entirely convinced that the limited liability company was just a clever temporary trick, and that Marcus secretly owned the beautiful property all by himself truly. She screamed that she was entitled to half the value of the estate, half of his corporate retirement accounts, and a massive monthly alimony payment to maintain the lifestyle she had become accustomed to during their marriage. Marcus tried to interrupt her, trying to explain that his corporate accounts were frozen by the federal government, and that he truly had absolutely no legal claim to my real estate holdings. Chloe covered her ears like a petulant child, refusing to listen to a single logical word. She accused him of hiding massive amounts of wealth in secret cryptocurrency accounts and funds. She genuinely believed that Marcus and I had orchestrated this entire elaborate scheme simply to hide his vast fortune from her so she would not get her fair share in a divorce settlement. Her greed had completely blinded her to the overwhelming reality of the federal criminal investigation hanging directly over their heads. She slammed the motel door violently in his face, sliding the heavy metal chain lock into place and leaving my son standing entirely alone on the dirty concrete walkway. He was locked out of the cheap motel room with absolutely nowhere to go at all tonight, unfortunately. He had no money in his pockets and no friends who would risk associating with a man under active federal investigation. The sun had completely set, casting long, dark shadows across the parking lot. Marcus gathered his scattered clothing from the ground, his hands shaking uncontrollably as the cold night air settled around him. He walked slowly toward a small wooden bench near the motel vending machines and sat down heavily in the darkness. The absolute crushing weight of his monumental failures finally broke through his stubborn denial right then and there on that cold wooden bench, sitting completely alone. The woman he had desperately tried to impress, the woman he had allowed to physically assault and disrespect his own mother, had discarded him like a piece of worthless trash the exact second his money ran out. He realized he had sacrificed his entire moral compass for an illusion that never actually existed. Sitting alone in the flickering light of the vending machine, Marcus pulled his deactivated mobile phone from his pocket. He remembered that while his cellular service was permanently disconnected, he could still connect to the unsecured wireless internet network provided by the cheap motel immediately right away. He connected to the weak signal and opened his internet calling application. He stared at my contact name on his screen for a very long time, his thumb hovering hesitantly over the call button. He knew he had absolutely no right to contact me after the horrible things he had said in the driveway of the empty house, but he was completely desperate, terrified, and entirely alone. He pressed the button and held the phone to his ear, listening to the digital ringing tone echo in the quiet night. I was sitting comfortably in my luxury hotel suite reading tonight. My phone began to buzz on the nightstand. I looked at the screen and saw his name flashing brightly. I let it ring 3 times before I calmly answered the call. I did not say hello. I simply waited for him to speak. "Mom!" His voice cracked immediately, sounding incredibly small and fragile. "Mom, please do not hang up on me." "I am so sorry," he cried out. "You were right about everything. You were right about Chloe and her family. She threw me out of the motel room, and she is filing for a divorce against me right now. She wants half the house, and she thinks I am hiding secret money," he continued, sobbing. "I have absolutely nothing left. Mom, my firm fired me today because the federal agents froze my accounts. I am sitting outside a cheap motel in the dark, and I am so scared. Please help me." I kept my voice completely cold. "I taught you pride, Marcus," I replied firmly. "Now you must learn the cost of your own stupidity." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to hang up, leaving him completely alone in the absolute darkness. The heavy oak doors of the family courthouse swung open, and the cold air of the legal system washed over the corridor. I sat quietly in the second row of the gallery, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a calm expression. I had spent decades in federal courtrooms watching sophisticated criminals squirm under oath, so this county divorce hearing felt like a minor theatrical production. I rested my hands quietly in my lap, preparing myself for the inevitable incoming storm of lies. Marcus sat at the respondent table looking entirely defeated. His shoulders were slumped forward, and the dark circles under his eyes revealed the sheer panic he had been living in since the federal agents destroyed his corporate career. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. His bank accounts were still frozen by the federal government, and his expensive suits were wrinkled from living out of a cheap suitcase. He looked like a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had chosen his entitled wife over his own mother just a few weeks prior. The heavy doors opened again, and Chloe walked into the courtroom accompanied by an incredibly expensive divorce attorney. I watched her entrance closely because I knew exactly what kind of performance she was going to deliver today. The woman who normally paraded around in tight designer dresses and carried luxury handbags worth more than most cars had completely transformed her appearance for the judge. She was wearing a modest, high-necked floral dress that fell well past her knees. She wore absolutely no makeup, and her normally perfectly styled blonde hair was pulled back into a simple, messy bun. She walked with her head bowed, clutching a plain tissue in her hand, playing the role of the terrified and abused young wife to absolute perfection. She wanted the judge to look at her and see a fragile, innocent victim who had been mercilessly crushed by a cruel family. She had clearly spent hours practicing her somber expressions in front of a mirror, ensuring every single tear fell at the exact perfect moment to maximize the sympathy of everyone watching her performance today. The judge, a stern-looking woman with gray hair, called the courtroom to order, and the proceedings officially began. Chloe's attorney wasted absolutely no time putting his star witness directly onto the stand. Chloe walked slowly to the witness box, keeping her eyes cast downward as she swore to tell the truth. The irony of that oath was incredibly thick, but I maintained my passive expression from the gallery. Her lawyer began asking her softly worded questions designed to elicit maximum emotional damage. Chloe answered with a trembling voice that frequently cracked under the weight of her fabricated sorrow. She described her marriage to my son as a terrifying prison of financial control and emotional abuse. She cried heavy, silent tears as she told the judge that she had dedicated her entire youth to supporting Marcus and building a beautiful life together. She completely ignored the reality that she had never worked a single day during their marriage and had spent all of her time buying luxury goods and creating fake social media videos. Instead, she painted herself as a devoted homemaker who had been violently thrown out onto the literal street without a single penny to her name. She told the court that Marcus had secretly drained their accounts and was deliberately hiding his massive corporate wealth in offshore funds just to leave her destitute. Then she turned her dramatic performance toward me. She pointed a shaking finger at me sitting quietly in the gallery and accused me of being the mastermind behind her complete financial ruin. She claimed that I had always hated her and that I had used my extreme wealth to manipulate their marriage. She sobbed uncontrollably as she described the morning the moving trucks arrived, completely omitting the part where she had hurled scalding hot coffee directly at my chest. She told the judge that I had stolen all of her personal belongings, her expensive furniture, and her sense of safety, leaving her completely traumatized and homeless. Her attorney paced back and forth across the polished wooden floor, soaking up the dramatic tension his client had expertly created. He spoke with a booming, authoritative voice, demanding absolute justice for this poor, defenseless woman. He presented a massive binder of fabricated financial projections and lifestyle requirements. He argued that Chloe had grown completely accustomed to a high-net-worth lifestyle during the marriage and that the court had a strict legal obligation to maintain her standard of living. He demanded an astronomical sum for monthly alimony payments, claiming she needed the money to recover from the severe emotional distress caused by our supposed financial abuse. He spoke about the $1.5 million house in the affluent suburbs, describing it as the primary marital asset. He told the judge that Marcus and I had orchestrated a fraudulent eviction solely to deprive his client of her rightful half of the marital estate. He requested an emergency court order to force the immediate sale of the property. He argued that the proceeds from the house sale should be directly transferred to Chloe as a lump sum settlement for her pain, suffering, and future housing needs. He painted Marcus as a vindictive husband who was sitting on a mountain of hidden wealth while his poor wife was forced to beg for charity on the internet just to survive. He forcefully slammed his hand down onto the wooden table to emphasize his ridiculous points, trying to use sheer volume to compensate for his complete lack of actual factual evidence. The judge listened intently to the impassioned speech, taking careful notes, and occasionally looking at Marcus with a severe expression of deep disapproval. The narrative Chloe and her lawyer were spinning was incredibly compelling if you did not know the actual truth. They were using the legal system exactly how they had used social media, a weapon to extract money through pure emotional manipulation. Chloe sat in the witness box, dabbing her dry eyes with her tissue, looking incredibly satisfied with the destruction she was causing. She genuinely believed she had successfully cornered my son and that the judge was going to hand her the keys to my corporate real estate holdings. Marcus sat completely paralyzed at his table. He had no money to hire a high-powered defense attorney, so he was sitting there essentially representing himself. He opened his mouth to object to the blatant lies being told about his hidden assets and the house, but he was entirely overwhelmed by the aggressive legal terminology and the sheer audacity of her completely fabricated stories. He stammered, trying to explain that his bank accounts were genuinely frozen by the federal government and that he had absolutely no hidden money anywhere. But his weak protests only made him look exactly like the guilty, deceptive husband Chloe was portraying him to be. Her lawyer continued his relentless assault. He demanded that the court immediately freeze all assets associated with my son and order a comprehensive forensic audit of my personal finances as well. He claimed that because I had allegedly participated in the fraudulent eviction, I was a willing co-conspirator in the financial abuse of his client. He told the judge that Chloe deserved every single penny tied up in that $1.5 million estate, and he formally submitted the motion to compel the immediate liquidation of the property. The courtroom was completely silent as the heavy weight of his demands settled over the room. Chloe offered a tiny triumphant smirk, realizing she was moments away from getting exactly what she wanted. She was already calculating exactly how many luxury handbags and expensive vacations she was going to purchase, the absolute minute the judge handed her a massive settlement check. The judge adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the massive pile of motions submitted by Chloe, expensive attorney. She let out a long sigh and turned her attention directly to the defense table, where Marcus was sitting looking like a man waiting for his final execution. The judge asked Marcus if he had any formal legal representation or any documented evidence to present in response to these incredibly severe financial demands regarding the marital estate. Marcus looked down at his empty hands, his face completely pale and completely devoid of any remaining hope. He swallowed hard and prepared to tell the judge that he had absolutely nothing to offer. He fully accepted his total destruction. But before Marcus could utter a single pathetic word, the heavy wooden gate separating the gallery from the legal floor swung open with a loud, sharp click. Malik, my brilliant nephew and highly ruthless corporate attorney, stepped through the gate. He was wearing an impeccably tailored dark suit and carrying his signature heavy leather briefcase. He walked with a calm, steady confidence that immediately shifted the entire energetic dynamic of the room. Malik walked directly past Marcus and approached the center podium, standing tall and looking directly at the judge. The opposing lawyer glared at him, clearly annoyed by the sudden, unexpected interruption. Chloe gripped the edges of the witness stand, her triumphant smirk instantly vanishing as she recognized the man who had completely dismantled her reality in the driveway just a few weeks ago. Malik calmly unbuttoned his suit jacket, adjusted his collar, and rested his hands firmly on the wooden podium. He did not look at Chloe, and he did not look at her expensive attorney. He looked straight at the judge and spoke with a voice that was perfectly clear and absolutely devastating. "Your Honor," Malik said, his voice ringing with absolute authority through the silent courtroom. "My name is Malik Washington, and I am here representing Ironclad Holdings, the sole legal owner of the property in question. We formally motion to dismiss all claims regarding the liquidation of this real estate. Opposing counsel is currently attempting to divide a $1.5 million asset that quite simply does not exist within the legal boundaries of this marriage." The courtroom remained perfectly silent after Malik delivered his opening statement. The opposing attorney stared at him, with his mouth hanging slightly open, completely unsure of how to process the sudden appearance of a corporate lawyer in a standard family court proceeding. The judge leaned forward, adjusting her glasses, and asked Malik to approach the bench and provide the documentation he was referencing. Malik nodded respectfully and walked forward with his heavy leather briefcase. He opened the brass locks with a loud click that echoed through the quiet room. He retrieved a thick stack of legally bound papers printed on high-quality parchment and handed them directly to the bailiff, who passed them up to the judge. I sat perfectly still in the second row of the gallery, watching the exact moment the balance of power shifted entirely in our favor. I had spent countless hours preparing these specific documents, ensuring there was absolutely no room for interpretation or legal maneuvering. These documents, Your Honor, represent the complete and total corporate filings for Ironclad Holdings, Malik explained with a calm and measured voice. As you can clearly see on page 4, my client, Desdemona Washington, is the sole proprietor and managing director of the Limited Liability Company. Furthermore, page 12 contains the original warranty deed for the property located in the affluent suburban neighborhood that opposing counsel just spent 20 minutes aggressively demanding be liquidated for his client. The papers were signed, sealed, and officially recorded at the local county clerk office exactly 3 years ago. There is absolutely no ambiguity regarding the absolute legal ownership of this estate. It is a corporate asset, shielded completely from any marital disputes or divorce settlements occurring in this room today. The judge spent several long minutes flipping through the heavy stack of documents. The only sound in the courtroom was the rustling of thick paper and the heavy breathing of Chloe, who was practically gripping the edges of the witness stand so hard her knuckles were turning completely white. The judge examined the official county seals, the recorded dates, and the corporate ownership percentages. She traced her finger down the lines of legal text, verifying every single claim Malik had just confidently presented to the court. She looked up from the paperwork and directed a very stern look toward Chloe and her highly expensive divorce attorney. Counselor, the judge, said, her voice dripping with absolute judicial irritation. It appears your client and her husband have been living entirely rent-free in a corporate-owned property. The husband, Marcus Washington, is not listed anywhere on the deed, the mortgage, the property tax records, or the corporate articles of incorporation. He does not own a single brick of that $1.5 million house. Therefore, the house is absolutely not a marital asset, and this court has zero jurisdiction to order its sale or division under any circumstances. The opposing attorney scrambled to gather his thoughts. He flipped wildly through his thinly researched files, searching for a loophole that simply did not exist. He was a man accustomed to bullying weak husbands into terrible settlements, but he was completely unprepared to fight a retired federal auditor and a ruthless corporate lawyer. "But, Your Honor," he stammered, his booming voice completely reduced to a nervous squeak. "My client was led to believe that her husband was the sole owner of the estate. They lived there for their entire marriage, building a life under that specific assumption. Surely the court must recognize the concept of equitable distribution based on the marital lifestyle and the promises made to my client by her husband," he argued desperately. Malik did not even let the judge answer that ridiculous legal argument. He stepped forward again, maintaining his perfect posture and completely unbothered expression. Ignorance of the law and ignorance of property ownership does not magically manufacture legal equity, Malik countered smoothly, his voice cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. A guest living in a luxury hotel does not suddenly own the building just because they slept in the comfortable bed for 3 years. Marcus Washington was nothing more than a permitted guest of Ironclad Holdings. His tenancy was legally terminated due to the hostile and destructive actions of his wife. End of discussion. Chloe sat in the witness box, watching her expensive legal strategy disintegrate into absolute dust right before her eyes. She looked over at Marcus, who was staring down at his empty hands, looking completely numb to the entire process. The horrifying reality finally pierced through her thick wall of entitlement and delusion. She realized that Marcus was not a wealthy corporate executive hiding a secret fortune in offshore accounts. He was exactly what he appeared to be at this moment, which was a completely broke, unemployed man who had relied entirely on his mother to fund his luxurious lifestyle. Her face contorted into an ugly mask of pure rage. She abandoned her carefully crafted innocent victim persona, entirely forgetting that she was supposed to be playing the role of a terrified and abused young wife. She slammed her hands down on the hard wooden railing of the witness box and began screaming directly at Marcus, completely ignoring the judge. "You lied to me!" she yelled, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings of the courtroom. "You told me you bought that house. You told me you were rich and successful. You are nothing but a pathetic loser who lives off his mommy, and you tricked me into marrying you. I wasted the best years of my life on a man who owns absolutely nothing, and I want my money right now." The judge banged her wooden gavel loudly, demanding immediate order in her courtroom. She warned Chloe that any further outbursts would result in her being held in contempt of court and escorted to a holding cell. Chloe sank back into the witness chair, breathing heavily, her modest floral dress suddenly looking incredibly ridiculous against her aggressive and greedy behavior. Her attorney practically sprinted to the podium, desperately trying to salvage whatever was left of his massive contingency fee. He realized the beautiful house was completely out of reach, so he pivoted his strategy toward extracting maximum emotional compensation from my son. "If the property cannot be divided." "Your Honor," he argued, waving his hands frantically in the air, "then we must address the horrific and traumatic manner in which my client was illegally evicted from her primary residence." He dramatically gestured toward Chloe, who immediately attempted to force more fake tears from her dry eyes. "My client was subjected to extreme emotional distress," he continued, his voice rising in volume again. She returned home to find her entire life completely stripped away without any prior warning whatsoever. The psychological trauma of standing in an empty house believing she had been violently robbed has caused severe anxiety and deep mental anguish that will require years of expensive therapy to fully overcome. We formally demand that Marcus Washington be held completely and financially responsible for this profound emotional trauma. Furthermore, we are officially requesting that the court award my client a massive lump sum for emotional damages to be paid directly from whatever hidden retirement accounts or future earnings the respondent might possess. She deserves full compensation for the absolute nightmare she was forced to endure during that terrifying eviction process orchestrated by his highly wealthy and incredibly vindictive family members living nearby. The courtroom grew quiet again as the lawyer finished his dramatic speech. He looked incredibly proud of himself, believing he had successfully painted Chloe as the ultimate suffering victim of a cruel and completely unjustified psychological attack designed to ruin her life. Marcus kept his head down, too ashamed to even look at the judge. He knew he had absolutely no money to pay for any emotional damages, but he was entirely incapable of defending himself against the vicious lies being told about the eviction. I watched closely from the hard wooden gallery benches, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction bubbling just beneath the surface of my calm exterior. They were walking directly into the final trap we had carefully laid out for them today. The judge looked incredibly exhausted by the relentless demands and the theatrical performances of the opposing counsel. She rubbed her temples and turned her attention back to Malik, who was standing near the defense table, looking completely unbothered by the dramatic performance. Malik offered a polite, incredibly sharp smile that instantly sent a cold shiver of absolute fear down Chloe's fragile spine. He slowly reached into his heavy leather briefcase one more time. He pulled out a very small black digital storage drive and held it up clearly for the judge to see. "Speaking of trauma and the eviction, Your Honor," Malik said, his voice echoing smoothly through the quiet courtroom, "I have a video submission regarding the defendant and her absolute respect for property." The quiet atmosphere of the courtroom grew incredibly tense as Malik held the small black digital storage drive in the air for the judge to see. The expensive attorney representing Chloe immediately jumped out of his leather chair and began waving his hands frantically, attempting to block the submission of new evidence. He stammered loudly, claiming that the video was completely irrelevant to the divorce proceedings and that it had not been submitted during the initial discovery phase of the trial. He knew his client had a volatile temper, and he was terrified of whatever visual proof Malik held today. Malik did not raise his voice or argue aggressively. He simply stood at the wooden podium with perfect posture and waited for the frantic lawyer to finish his desperate objections. When the room finally quieted down, Malik addressed the judge with a smooth and highly professional tone. He explained that since opposing counsel had just spent the last 10 minutes demanding massive financial compensation for the supposed severe emotional distress and trauma his client allegedly suffered during the eviction process, the defense had an absolute legal right to present direct factual evidence regarding her actual emotional state that specific afternoon. The judge adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the frantic opposing attorney with a severe expression. She agreed entirely with Malik, stating that if the plaintiff was going to use emotional trauma as a primary justification for extracting a massive financial settlement, the court needed to see the full context of that supposed trauma. She overruled the desperate objection and instructed the courtroom bailiff to take the digital drive from Malik and connect it to the official audio-visual system. The bailiff walked over to the podium, took the small black device and plugged it in securely now. A massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the wood-paneled wall of the courtroom flickered to life. Chloe sat completely frozen in the wooden witness box. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. She suddenly remembered exactly what she had done on the front lawn of the empty house after the police officers had driven away. She remembered the heavy golf club and the beautiful custom window. She looked over at her attorney with wide, panicked eyes, but there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop the devastating reality broadcasting right now here. The video began to play on the large screen in crisp, high-definition quality. Because I had recorded the footage from the safety of my parked luxury sedan, the camera angle provided a perfect wide and unobstructed view of the pristine concrete driveway, the manicured front lawn, and the grand entrance of the property. The courtroom watched as the hysterical weeping victim, who had just been crying on the witness stand, was completely replaced by a violent and totally unhinged woman on the screen. The video showed Chloe screaming aggressively at my son before marching toward his open bag outside. The digital audio was incredibly clear, capturing every single venomous insult and vile curse word she hurled into the quiet suburban air. She did not look like a woman suffering from severe psychological trauma or debilitating emotional abuse. She looked like an entitled, spoiled child throwing a massive, violent temper tantrum because she was denied access to a credit card. The entire courtroom watched in absolute stunned silence as the digital version of Chloe grabbed a heavy, solid metal golf club from the bag. She marched aggressively up the concrete steps toward the large custom front window glass pane now. Her face was twisted into an incredibly ugly mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She raised the heavy metal club high above her blonde head and swung it forward with all the frantic physical strength she could possibly muster. The metal head of the club struck the thick, decorative glass with a deafening, terrifying crash that echoed loudly through the courtroom speakers, making several people in the gallery physically jump in their seats. The expensive custom window shattered instantly, sending hundreds of sharp glass shards raining down onto the front porch. The video continued to play, showing her swinging again wildly. She completely destroyed the beautiful window frame and smashed a large decorative ceramic planter into a dozen dusty pieces across the walkway. When the short video finally concluded, the screen faded to black, and the courtroom was left in a heavy, suffocating silence. The absolute sheer violence and total lack of control displayed on the monitor stood in stark, completely undeniable contrast to the modest floral dress and the fake silent tears Chloe had presented to the judge just moments prior. The expensive attorney representing her physically slumped back into his chair, resting his forehead heavily against his hand, defeated. He closed his eyes completely, realizing that his highly lucrative case had just been entirely incinerated. He was a professional who knew when a battle was permanently lost, and this battle had just become a catastrophic legal disaster. Marcus sat at the respondent table, keeping his eyes focused on the polished wooden floor. He looked deeply ashamed of the woman he had chosen to marry and the horrific behavior he had allowed to continue for so long. The judge stared at the blank screen for a very long time before slowly turning her attention back toward the witness box directly. When she finally looked at Chloe, her expression was one of profound, absolute disgust. The judicial neutrality she had maintained throughout the morning had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, stern anger. The judge leaned forward, resting her arms on her high, elevated desk, and began to speak with a voice that carried the heavy weight of absolute finality. She told Chloe that in her 20 years sitting on the family court bench, she had rarely witnessed such a blatant, highly offensive attempt to completely manipulate the judicial system. She stated clearly that the tears Chloe cried were entirely fake. She declared that the theatrical performance was designed entirely to extort money from an innocent family. The judge did not mince her words. She told Chloe that her completely fabricated claims of emotional abuse and trauma were a profound insult to the actual victims of domestic violence who walk into her courtroom every single day seeking genuine protection. She explicitly stated that a person who is capable of such calculated physical violence and willful destruction of private property is not a helpless victim, but rather a highly dangerous aggressor. Therefore, the judge announced she was formally denying all requests immediately. She stated loudly that she was permanently denying every single request for monthly alimony payments. She stated that Marcus Washington owed her absolutely nothing. There would be no division of the corporate real estate asset, and there would certainly be no compensation for any fabricated emotional distress. Chloe sat in the witness chair, breathing heavily, her chest heaving up and down. She looked completely, utterly destroyed, but the judge was absolutely not finished with her yet. The judge turned her severe gaze toward Malik, who was still standing calmly at the podium, observing the complete destruction of the plaintiff carefully. She informed Malik that the court took the malicious destruction of corporate property incredibly seriously, because Chloe had willfully and violently destroyed a custom architectural feature of a home entirely owned by Ironclad Holdings. She was legally and financially liable for the complete cost of the necessary repairs. The judge reviewed the initial damage estimates Malik had included in his comprehensive corporate filing folder. She slammed her wooden gavel down onto the sounding block with a loud, sharp crack. She officially ordered Chloe to pay $50,000 in direct restitution and legal fees to my corporate business entity directly. The reality of the devastating verdict crashed down onto Chloe like a massive falling building. She had walked into the courthouse that morning expecting to walk out as a wealthy, independent woman with a massive settlement check and a forced sale of $1 million home. Instead, she was leaving completely empty-handed, totally unemployed, completely homeless, and saddled with a massive $50,000 legal judgment that she had absolutely no way to pay. The sheer weight of her total monumental failure finally caused her fragile mind to completely snap right there in the quiet, formal courtroom today, immediately. Chloe suddenly stood up in the wooden witness box, knocking the small microphone completely over. She began screaming at the absolute top of her lungs, completely ignoring the frantic warnings of the angry judge. She pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at Marcus, who was still sitting frozen at his table. She screamed that the entire trial was completely rigged and that Marcus was secretly hiding massive amounts of offshore cryptocurrency assets. She yelled that if she could not get the house, she deserved every single penny of the GoFundMe money because her life was completely ruined forever right now. The echo of Chloe screaming about hidden cryptocurrency and offshore accounts bounced off the heavy wooden walls of the courtroom. She was completely unhinged, standing in the witness box and pointing her shaking finger at Marcus. She demanded that the judge force him to surrender the money she had collected from her online crowdfunding campaign because she believed she was owed every single penny for her suffering. Marcus sat frozen at his table for a long moment, simply staring at the woman he had sacrificed his entire relationship with his mother to protect. He looked at her tear-stained face, her expensive, modest dress, and the pure, greedy desperation burning in her eyes. For 3 years, he had bent over backwards to accommodate her endless demands. He had allowed himself to be manipulated into participating in a federal financial crime just to keep her dressed in designer clothing and living in a luxury home he could never actually afford. He had watched her throw scalding hot coffee onto the chest of the woman who gave him life, and he had defended her. But watching her stand in a court of law demanding the profits of a fraudulent internet scam after she had just been ordered to pay $50,000 for violently vandalizing his mother property finally broke something deep inside his mind. The heavy veil of denial completely lifted from his eyes. He realized that she did not love him, and she had never loved him at all. She only loved what he could provide, and now that he was empty, she was trying to scrape the very bottom of his soul for spare change. Marcus slowly pushed his chair back from the heavy wooden table. The loud scraping sound of the wooden legs dragging across the polished floor made everyone in the room suddenly turn to look at him. He stood up incredibly straight and looked directly at the judge. He did not ask for permission from his non-existent legal counsel, and he did not look toward Malik for any guidance. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice starting out slightly shaky before completely solidifying into a tone of absolute resolute certainty. "I request permission to take the witness stand immediately. I have a formal statement I need to make on the official court record regarding the hidden financial assets my wife is currently screaming about." The expensive attorney representing Chloe immediately began to panic again, realizing that a hostile husband taking the stand voluntarily was a massive, unpredictable liability. He jumped up and tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a single severe wave of her hand. She was completely exhausted by Chloe and her dramatic outbursts, and she was highly interested in whatever truth Marcus was finally ready to share. The judge instructed the bailiff to swear Marcus in. He walked slowly across the courtroom floor, his footsteps echoing loudly, until he reached the wooden box. Chloe was forced to step down, and she glared at him with absolute venom as they passed each other. Marcus placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the whole truth, and sat down heavily in the leather chair. He adjusted the small microphone in front of him and looked out across the gallery, making brief eye contact with me before turning his attention entirely back to the judge. I sat perfectly still, waiting for my son to finally take responsibility for his own pathetic life. "Your Honor, my wife is entirely correct about one specific thing," Marcus began, his voice echoing clearly through the speaker system. "There are hidden financial assets, and there are secret corporate bank accounts. However, those accounts do not belong to me, and they certainly do not belong to my mother. The money she is demanding belongs to a fraudulent corporate shell company created and operated entirely by her father, Richard Kensington." The courtroom fell incredibly silent. Even Chloe stopped her frantic pacing and stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. Marcus took a deep breath and completely threw his wife and her entire corrupt family directly under the proverbial bus. He testified on the official court record that Richard was drowning in massive, insurmountable debt and had used Marcus as a puppet director to secure fraudulent business loans and evade federal taxes. He explained exactly how the shell company named Kensington Global Logistics was a fake entity designed specifically to launder dirty money and shield Richard from his angry creditors. He admitted his own guilt in the process, confessing that he had knowingly signed the fraudulent corporate documents because he was desperate to maintain the illusion of wealth that his wife constantly demanded. He told the judge that his own corporate career had been completely destroyed just days ago, when federal agents formally froze all of his bank accounts due to his direct involvement in Richard's massive financial crimes. He laid his own total destruction bare for the entire court to see, holding absolutely nothing back to protect himself or his wife. The judge was taking frantic notes on her legal pad, her eyes wide with shock as the divorce hearing suddenly transformed into a massive federal criminal confession. But Marcus was not finished. He turned his head and looked directly at Chloe, who was now trembling uncontrollably at the plaintiff table. "As for the GoFundMe campaign money my wife is currently demanding," Marcus continued, his voice growing louder and far more aggressive, "that was not a charity fund to help a homeless family. That was a highly coordinated digital scam. Chloe completely fabricated the story of our eviction to manipulate her social media followers into sending her cash, and she did not use a single penny of that $60,000 to look for emergency housing or buy basic necessities. She knowingly committed wire fraud across state lines. She funneled the entire amount directly into her father's fraudulent shell company account to hide the funds from the public platform." Marcus leaned forward into the microphone, ensuring every single word was perfectly captured by the court stenographer. He detailed exactly how Chloe had bragged to him in their cheap motel room about using a portion of the stolen donation money to purchase new designer handbags and expensive shoes to replace the ones she had left behind in the master bedroom pile. He exposed her complete lack of empathy, her staggering greed, and her absolute willingness to lie to thousands of people just to maintain her toxic lifestyle. He painted a perfectly accurate picture of a woman who was a calculated financial predator, completely destroying the false narrative of the innocent victim she had spent the entire morning trying to sell to the judge. Chloe could no longer handle the absolute exposure of her dark reality. She jumped out of her chair, knocking it over backward with a loud crash. "You are a liar!" she screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure hysterical panic. "You are making all of this up to ruin me because you are a broke, pathetic loser." She grabbed a thick legal binder from her table and threw it aggressively across the room toward the witness stand. The heavy binder hit the wooden floor and burst open, scattering hundreds of meaningless papers everywhere. She lost her mind completely, screaming violently at Marcus, threatening to kill him and calling him every vile name she could possibly imagine. The judge grabbed her wooden gavel and began banging it repeatedly against the sounding block, demanding immediate order and instructing the bailiff to physically restrain the plaintiff. The courtroom was consumed by absolute total chaos. Chloe was thrashing wildly against the wooden table, fighting against her own expensive attorney, who was desperately trying to pull her back into her seat to avoid a criminal contempt charge. Marcus sat in the witness box, watching her complete mental collapse with a calm, detached expression, finally free from the heavy burden of her constant manipulation. He had lost absolutely everything, but in the process, he had finally found his voice. I watched the scene unfold from the gallery, feeling a deep sense of absolute finality. The trap was now fully sprung. Right at the exact moment, Chloe let out a piercing scream, demanding that Marcus be arrested for lying. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly swung open wide. The sound of the doors hitting the wooden stops cut through the frantic noise of the room instantly. Everyone, including the angry judge and the screaming plaintiff, froze and turned to look at the entrance. Two tall men wearing dark suits and serious expressions walked confidently into the formal family courtroom. They bypassed the gallery seating completely and walked straight down the center aisle. The man in the front reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a heavy gold badge, and held it up for the judge to see clearly. The federal agents had finally arrived. The heavy oak doors at the very back of the courtroom remained wide open as the two tall men in dark suits stepped inside. The entire room had been consumed by the chaotic screaming of my daughter-in-law just seconds before, but the sudden arrival of these strangers brought an immediate and terrifying silence to the space. The man in the lead was a broad-shouldered federal agent with sharp, piercing eyes and an expression completely devoid of any sympathy or warmth. He held his shiny gold shield high enough in the air for the stern family court judge to see it clearly from her elevated wooden bench. The judge lowered her heavy wooden gavel, slowly placing it down onto the sounding block without making another sound. She nodded her head in silent understanding and signaled for the court bailiffs to stand down and let the federal authorities proceed with their official business. The agents walked deliberately down the center aisle of the formal courtroom. Their heavy leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the polished wooden floor, echoing loudly in the absolute stillness of the room. They bypassed the wooden benches of the public gallery where the spectators sat completely frozen in shock. They walked right past the defense table where my son Marcus remained seated. Marcus did not even turn his head to look at the approaching law enforcement officers. He kept his tired eyes locked firmly onto his own hands, resting on the table, looking completely drained of any remaining emotional energy. The agents walked past my brilliant nephew Malik, who simply adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit and offered the men a very subtle nod of professional recognition. The trap we had all carefully constructed was finally snapping shut in the most public and completely humiliating way possible. The lead federal agent stopped directly in front of the plaintiff table where Chloe was standing. She was still breathing heavily from her frantic screaming fit, her chest heaving up and down beneath the modest floral dress she had specifically worn to deceive the judge today. She looked at the gold shield shining in the hand of the tall man, and the remaining color in her face drained away completely, leaving her looking like a terrified, pale ghost. The agent asked her to confirm her full legal name for the official record. His voice was deep and commanded absolute authority, leaving absolutely no room for any further theatrical performances or manipulative lies. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords completely failed her in her moment of extreme panic. She simply nodded her head in a jerky, frantic motion, unable to form a single coherent word. The federal agent did not waste a single second of his time. He looked her directly in the eyes and informed her that she was being placed under formal arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He listed the severe federal charges against her with a cold, mechanical precision that sent a visible physical shiver down her spine. He stated that she was being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud conspiracy to commit wire fraud and active participation in an ongoing federal money laundering operation. He explicitly mentioned the digital crowdfunding campaign she had launched on the internet, citing the exact dollar amount she had stolen from innocent, sympathetic people across the country. He explained that her careless digital footprint had provided them with all the necessary electronic evidence to secure a federal warrant for her immediate detention. Chloe staggered backward as if the spoken words were brutal physical blows striking her directly in the face. She bumped hard into the heavy wooden edge of the witness stand and nearly lost her balance completely. Her highly expensive divorce attorney, the man who had confidently walked into the courtroom demanding half of my real estate empire, immediately took 3 large steps away from her. He physically distanced himself from his own client, wanting absolutely nothing to do with an active federal criminal investigation. He knew his prestigious career could be severely damaged by associating with a client actively committing felony fraud during a civil trial, so he simply packed his briefcases and abandoned her defense right there on the spot. He did not offer a single word of legal counsel or any basic human comfort as the tall agents moved closer to her trembling body. The second federal agent stepped forward and firmly grabbed her wrist to secure her. Chloe suddenly snapped out of her frozen state of shock and began to panic wildly. She tried to pull her arms away, shaking her head back and forth and crying out that there had been a massive, terrible mistake. She yelled that she was just an innocent victim and that her father was the only one responsible for the fraudulent corporate accounts. But the federal agents did not care about her frantic excuses or her sudden desperate attempts to blame her own family members for her blatant crimes. The agent pulled her arms forcefully behind her back, and the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked loudly around her delicate wrists. The sharp metallic clicking sound echoed through the entire courtroom, sealing her terrible fate permanently and undeniably. As the heavy handcuffs locked tightly into place, the lead agent began reciting her Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice. He told her that she had the absolute right to remain silent and that anything she said could and absolutely would be used against her in a court of law. He told her she had the right to an attorney during any future questioning. Every single word he spoke completely destroyed another layer of the fake, luxurious life she had desperately tried to hold on to for so many years. Chloe began to sob hysterically, her entire body shaking with pure, uncontrollable terror. The fake, silent tears she had squeezed out earlier for the sympathetic judge were now completely replaced by massive, ugly sobs of genuine, overwhelming despair. The tears streamed heavily down her face, completely ruining her carefully applied, expensive makeup. Thick black streams of dark mascara ran down her pale cheeks, dripping onto the high collar of her modest floral dress and leaving dark, ugly stains on the pristine fabric. Her blonde hair fell messily across her face, making her look completely unhinged and totally broken. She begged the federal agents to let her go, promising to give all the stolen money back to the internet donors immediately. She pleaded with the stern judge to intervene, claiming that a family court could not possibly allow this to happen to a young, innocent wife. But the judge simply stared down at her with an expression of profound disgust, offering absolutely no mercy or intervention whatsoever. The legal system she had tried to manipulate to steal my hard-earned wealth was now the exact instrument of her total destruction. The federal agents grabbed her firmly by her upper arms and began to physically march her away from the plaintiff table. Chloe realized that nobody in the front of the formal courtroom was going to save her from going to federal prison. She looked at Marcus, begging him to tell the agents she was innocent, but Marcus simply turned his face away completely, refusing to even acknowledge her existence anymore. She looked at Malik, who offered her nothing but a cold, highly satisfied stare. In her absolute final moment of desperate, frantic panic, she turned her head wildly toward the public gallery, searching frantically for the only person she believed would still fight for her. She searched the wooden benches for her mother, Susan, who had been sitting quietly in the very back row, watching the entire divorce proceeding unfold. Susan had come to this county courthouse expecting to celebrate a massive financial victory with her spoiled daughter. She had expected to walk out with a lucrative court order forcing the immediate sale of my $1-million suburban property. But as she watched the federal agents place the cold steel handcuffs onto the wrists of her crying daughter, the reality of their massive criminal exposure crashed down upon her heavily. Susan knew that her husband Richard had already been arrested on the golf course earlier that week. She knew that the federal authorities were actively seizing all of their personal assets and thoroughly investigating their entire fake corporate empire. Watching Chloe being arrested for the exact same federal crimes made Susan realize a truly terrifying truth. The federal agents would inevitably be coming for her next if they discovered she had any direct involvement in hiding or spending the stolen money. Chloe spotted her mother sitting nervously in the back row of the gallery. "Mom!" she screamed loudly, her voice cracking with pure agonizing terror. "Mom, please help me. They are arresting me. Please do not let them take me away. Mom, you have to do something." Chloe struggled uselessly against the firm, strong grip of the two federal agents, her black mascara-stained face contorting into a mask of absolute childish desperation. She expected her mother to rush forward to scream at the officers to demand justice and to passionately protect her little girl just like she always had before whenever Chloe threw a tantrum. But Susan did not rush forward to save her daughter. Susan stood up slowly from the hard wooden bench, her own face extremely pale and filled with absolute cowardice. She looked at her daughter struggling helplessly in the heavy steel handcuffs. She looked at the severe federal agents staring coldly back at her from the front of the room. And then Susan made the ultimate selfish choice to protect herself. Terrified of being implicated in the federal conspiracy and completely desperate to save her own skin, Susan slowly turned her face away from her screaming child. She did not say a single word of comfort to her daughter. She did not shed a single tear of sadness. Susan grabbed her expensive designer handbag, turned her back on her only child, and walked quickly out of the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, completely abandoning Chloe to her terrible fate. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind Susan with a dull, heavy thud, leaving Chloe staring at the empty space where her mother had just been standing moments ago. The absolute betrayal shattered the very last fragile piece of Chloe's mind. She let out a long, agonizing wail of pure, total despair that chilled the blood of everyone listening in the silent room. She slumped forward completely, losing the ability to support her own physical weight, and the federal agents had to physically drag her, pulling her expensive shoes across the polished floor toward the rear exit. I sat quietly in the gallery, watching the sobbing, mascara-stained woman being pulled from the room permanently. She had wanted to destroy my family for money. But in the very end, her own family had destroyed her and left her completely alone in the dark to face the severe consequences of her boundless greed. Exactly 1 week after the dramatic and terrifying events unfolded inside the county courthouse, I found myself sitting quietly in the familiar wooden pew of my local church. The sanctuary was entirely empty on this particular Tuesday afternoon, providing a profound and necessary silence that my soul desperately craved. The late afternoon sun filtered beautifully through the tall stained glass windows, casting long, vibrant geometric shadows across the polished wooden floorboards. I sat near the front row wearing a simple conservative dress, listening to the faint, comforting hum of the building ventilation system. The heavy scent of old wood and burning candle wax filled the cool air, wrapping around me like a protective and familiar blanket. I had spent the past 7 days systematically closing the final chapters of my previous life. I officially sold the massive, empty suburban house to a wealthy real estate developer, and I formally transferred all my corporate assets into a highly secure blind trust managed entirely by Malik. The federal investigation dominating the local news cycle had already resulted in multiple indictments for Richard and his shell company associates, while Chloe sat alone in a federal holding facility awaiting her formal arraignment today. The chaotic storm had finally passed, leaving a crisp, clean reality in its wake. But despite the legal victories and the complete financial vindication, a heavy, lingering sadness remained deeply anchored in my heart. The sadness was entirely centered on my only son, who had vanished completely into the sprawling city after walking out of that courtroom a completely broken and destitute man. The heavy oak doors at the very back of the sanctuary opened with a slow, drawn-out creak that echoed loudly across the empty, vaulted ceiling. I did not turn my head immediately, looking forward instead. I recognized the specific dragging rhythm of the footsteps walking slowly down the center aisle. The footsteps lacked the confident, arrogant bounce of a successful corporate executive. They were the heavy, shuffling steps of a man carrying the absolute crushing weight of his own monumental failures. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead on the simple wooden cross hanging above the main altar, waiting patiently for the inevitable confrontation. Marcus finally stopped walking when he reached the end of my specific wooden pew. I slowly turned my head to look at the boy I had raised completely by myself. The physical transformation he had undergone in just 7 short days was absolutely shocking to witness. He was no longer wearing his expensive tailored suits or his shiny imported leather shoes. He was wearing a faded gray hooded sweatshirt that looked incredibly worn and a pair of wrinkled denim jeans. His face was covered in a thick, uneven layer of dark stubble, and his eyes were deeply sunken, surrounded by dark, bruised-looking circles of extreme exhaustion. He looked incredibly frail and completely stripped of the false wealthy identity he had spent years meticulously crafting for his entitled wife. Marcus stood at the edge of the wooden pew, staring down at me with an expression of pure, absolute agony. He did not ask for permission to sit down next to me. Instead, his legs simply gave out entirely, and he collapsed heavily onto his knees, right there on the hard, polished wooden floor of the church aisle. He bowed his head deeply, letting his chin rest against his chest, and began to sob with a raw, agonizing intensity that echoed painfully through the silent sanctuary. He did not cry the fake, manipulative tears his wife had used before. These were the heavy, suffocating tears of a man whose entire soul had been ripped completely apart by his own cowardice. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking and trembling so violently he could barely form the simple word. "I am so incredibly sorry. I let you down in the worst possible way a son could ever betray a loving mother." He kept his head bowed, unable to even look me directly in the eyes as the painful confession poured out of him. He admitted absolutely everything, holding nothing back to protect his own shattered ego, offering complete, brutal honesty. He told me he knew Chloe was a greedy, gold-digging woman from the very beginning, but he was too weak and too desperate for validation to stop her. He sobbed as he recounted the countless times he had silently allowed her and her arrogant parents to make subtle racist comments and display blatant microaggressions toward our family and our culture. He confessed that he had traded his own pride and his deep respect for his mother just to fit into a shallow, wealthy, white suburban world that secretly despised him entirely based on his skin color and background. I sat perfectly still on the wooden pew, looking down at my weeping grown son. My heart ached with a very natural maternal instinct to reach out and pull him into a warm, forgiving embrace. The primal urge to comfort my crying child was incredibly strong, pulling at the very core of my being. But I forced my hands to remain resting calmly in my lap. I knew with absolute certainty that offering him a soft place to land right now would entirely destroy the difficult lesson he was currently learning. If I gave him money or offered shelter today, he would never truly understand the devastating consequences of his toxic choices. He would simply revert back to being a dependent, weak man, waiting for a strong woman to fix his broken life. I took a slow, deep breath and allowed the silence to stretch out between us, letting the heavy weight of his agonizing confession settle completely into the quiet space. When his heavy sobbing finally slowed down into quiet, ragged gasps, I spoke to him with a voice that was incredibly calm and entirely devoid of any anger or malice or any lingering, bitter feelings of resentment. I told him that I heard his apology and I accepted that his remorse was completely genuine. I explained that forgiveness is a free gift that a mother will always give to her child, but trust is an entirely different currency that must be earned through hard, consistent labor. Marcus slowly raised his head, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes, hoping desperately to see a sign that I was going to financially rescue him from his terrifying new reality. I reached into my small leather handbag resting on the wooden pew beside me, moving slowly and carefully. I did not pull out my checkbook, and I certainly did not pull out my premium black credit card. Instead, I retrieved a simple folded piece of white printer paper and a small white business card. I held the two items out toward him, keeping my hand perfectly steady. Marcus looked at the papers completely confused. He slowly reached up with shaking fingers and took them from my hand. He unfolded the piece of paper and stared blankly at the printed text. It was a printed flyer for a very basic, highly affordable boarding house located across the city. I explained to him that the boarding house rented small single rooms by the week and did not require a rigorous credit check or a massive security deposit. I told him it was not a luxury penthouse or $1 million suburban estate, but it had a clean bed, a locking door, and a shared kitchen where he could learn how to cook his own simple meals. I pointed to the small white business card he was holding in his other hand. I told him that the card contained the names and contact numbers of 3 highly respected community therapists specifically working on a sliding payment scale for men recovering from severe emotional abuse and financial ruin. I told him that his journey back to becoming a respectable, independent man was going to be incredibly long and deeply painful, and he was going to need professional guidance to rebuild his shattered moral compass. Marcus stared down at the simple papers in his hands, the stark reality of his completely destitute future staring right back at him. He realized in that exact profound moment that there would absolutely be no magical rescue coming from me at all this afternoon. There would be no secret bank accounts suddenly unlocked to save him. He had to climb out of the massive crater he had dug entirely by himself, using nothing but his own 2 hands. He looked up at me one last time, his eyes finally clearing with a new quiet understanding of the hard truth. He did not beg for money, and he did not throw a tantrum. "A mother's love is endless, but my bank account is closed," I said, my voice soft but completely immovable. Marcus accepts the paper, turns around, and walks away to start over from the absolute bottom. 6 months passed since the chaotic afternoon inside the county family courthouse. The swift and unforgiving hand of federal justice had completely dismantled the fraudulent illusion the Kensington family had spent decades meticulously building. When you construct your entire existence on a fragile foundation of lies and stolen money, the inevitable collapse is always spectacular and totally absolute. Richard Kensington, the arrogant patriarch who had once threatened to send me back to the ghetto, learned a very harsh lesson about how the real world operates. His highly expensive defense attorneys could do absolutely nothing to save him from the mountain of irrefutable digital evidence my forensic audit had provided to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Richard stood before a federal judge and was sentenced to serve 7 consecutive years in a minimum security federal correctional facility. He traded his tailored country club polo shirts and his expensive golf clubs for a standard-issue khaki prison uniform and a tiny concrete cell. There were no luxury cocktail parties or wealthy investors to manipulate behind the thick steel bars of his new permanent residence. He was reduced to a simple inmate number stripped entirely of the fake prestige and the unearned power he had used to intimidate and destroy innocent people for his entire adult life. His massive suburban mansion was immediately seized by the federal government and sold at a public auction to pay back a small fraction of the millions of dollars he had stolen from his investors. The remaining debts would follow him forever, completely ruining any chance he ever had of rebuilding his incredibly corrupt empire after his release. The devastating consequences of his massive financial crimes did not stop at the prison gates. His wife Susan, who had completely abandoned her own daughter in the courtroom out of pure selfish cowardice, found herself entirely alone and completely destitute. The federal authorities froze every single bank account tied to her name and confiscated her luxury vehicles, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the clothes hanging in her closet. Susan was forced to move out of her affluent neighborhood and rent a tiny, dilapidated apartment in a very dangerous part of the city. To survive and pay her basic utility bills, the woman who used to spend her afternoons drinking expensive champagne at exclusive day spas was forced to secure minimum wage employment. Susan now worked the grueling overnight shift at a cheap 24-hour discount grocery store. She spent her nights wearing a bright polyester uniform, sweeping the dirty linoleum floors, and stocking heavy cans of cheap soup onto the metal shelves. The profound humiliation of scanning discounted grocery items for the exact same working-class people she had spent her entire life mocking and looking down upon became her new daily reality. She had completely lost her wealthy social circle because nobody in high society wanted to associate with the wife of a convicted federal felon. Susan was completely isolated, trapped in a miserable, exhausting existence that she had absolutely no hope of ever escaping. Her former friends pretended they did not even know her whenever they accidentally crossed paths in the city, leaving her entirely invisible and forgotten by the society she loved. But the most satisfying downfall of all belonged entirely to my former daughter-in-law. Chloe had narrowly avoided serving a lengthy federal prison sentence by accepting a very strict plea agreement from the federal prosecutors. She had eagerly turned state evidence against her own father, providing the investigators with additional internal corporate documents in a desperate, pathetic attempt to save her own skin. In exchange for her complete cooperation, the federal judge sentenced her to 5 years of highly supervised probation and ordered her to pay massive financial restitution. She still owed my corporate holding company the $50,000 for the custom window she had violently smashed with the golf club, and she owed the federal government the entire $60,000 she had fraudulently collected through her deceitful internet crowdfunding campaign. Because she had a felony fraud conviction on her permanent public record, she found it completely impossible to secure any meaningful employment. No respectable company would ever hire a convicted thief to manage their finances or interact with their customers. She was completely blacklisted from the corporate world and entirely banished from the wealthy social circles she had once desperately clung to. She was forced to live in a tiny, rundown boarding house on the exact same undesirable side of town where her mother currently resided. Alongside her massive, crushing financial debt, the federal judge had mandated that Chloe perform exactly 1,000 hours of difficult manual community service. The judge specifically ordered that her community service be completed in public spaces to ensure she fully understood the severe impact of her selfish crimes against the community. On a blisteringly hot Tuesday afternoon, exactly 6 months after our final courtroom encounter, Chloe was serving her mandated time. She was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, pristine social media influencer who had thrown scalding hot coffee onto my chest. She was standing on the side of a busy paved road in one of the most affluent, wealthy neighborhoods in the entire state. She was wearing baggy, dirty denim jeans and an oversized, bright fluorescent orange safety vest with the words County Inmate Work Program printed boldly in thick black letters across the back. The sun was beating down on her mercilessly, causing thick streams of sweat to run down her flushed red face and soak completely through her cheap cotton shirt. Her normally perfect blonde hair was tied back in a messy, greasy knot, and her hands were covered in thick, protective industrial work gloves. She looked absolutely miserable, utterly defeated by the intense heat and the profound public embarrassment. She was holding a long metal trash grabber in one hand and dragging a heavy, thick black plastic garbage bag with the other. Her daily assignment was to walk miles along the edge of the busy road, picking up discarded fast food wrappers, crushed aluminum beverage cans, and dirty cigarette butts thrown from the windows of passing vehicles. The physical labor was incredibly exhausting, and her body ached deeply from the continuous repetitive bending and lifting. But the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the severe psychological torture she was currently enduring. The specific road she was assigned to clean was the exact same main road that led directly to the exclusive luxury shopping district she used to frequent when she was spending my son money. Every few minutes, a sleek luxury vehicle would drive past her, kicking up clouds of hot dust and dirty gravel into her sweating face. She had to constantly look down at the dirt, completely terrified that one of her former wealthy friends or social media followers might drive by and recognize the miserable, disgraced woman wearing the bright orange vest. She spent her entire afternoon choking on thick exhaust fumes and picking up filthy trash, completely consumed by the bitter, agonizing regret of her terrible life choices. She knew she had brought this entire nightmare upon herself through her staggering greed and her profound disrespect for my family. She reached a particularly dirty section of the grassy shoulder and bent down slowly to pick up a discarded broken glass bottle. Her breathing was incredibly heavy and ragged, and she paused for a brief moment to wipe the stinging, salty sweat from her tired red eyes using the rough back of her dirty canvas glove. The harsh reality of her current situation was inescapable and permanently fixed in stone. Every single passing hour felt like an absolute eternity. She was so completely focused on the miserable, tedious task at hand that she did not notice the sleek vehicle slowly approaching her from behind. The vehicle did not speed past her like the others had done all afternoon. Instead, it slowed down considerably smoothly, matching her slow, exhausted walking pace. It was a brand new, sleek, black Mercedes luxury sport utility vehicle. The highly expensive car practically glided across the hot asphalt, its powerful engine reduced to a barely audible quiet purr. It cast a dark, cooling shadow over the bright green grass right beside her heavy boots. Chloe finally heard the soft crunching sound of the thick tires rolling over the loose gravel, and she slowly turned her weary head to look. The dark black vehicle pulled up slowly and stopped perfectly alongside the grassy shoulder exactly 2 feet away from where Chloe was standing holding onto her heavy black garbage bag. Her heart began to pound wildly inside her chest, filled with immediate, profound dread. She knew that highly specific, expensive luxury vehicle. The heavily tinted passenger side window began to roll down with a soft, smooth mechanical hum, slowly revealing the freezing cool air-conditioned interior of the beautiful luxury cabin, hiding just inside the dark shadows waiting to speak directly. The blinding afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the pristine suburban street, baking the dark asphalt and radiating a suffocating heat that shimmered in the air. Chloe stood frozen on the grassy shoulder of the road, completely paralyzed by the sight of the massive black luxury vehicle that had just pulled up silently beside her. Her chest heaved up and down as she struggled to catch her breath, the thick fluorescent orange safety vest trapping the intense heat against her exhausted body. Sweat poured down her flushed face, stinging her eyes and soaking her cheap cotton shirt. She gripped tightly the metal handle of her trash grabber so tightly that her knuckles turned completely white, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The sleek black Mercedes sport utility vehicle sat idling on the gravel, its dark-tinted windows reflecting the bright suburban landscape like a flawless, dark mirror. She knew exactly who was sitting inside that beautiful, expensive machine. The heavy, oppressive silence of the affluent neighborhood was broken only by the soft, mechanical hum of the passenger side window slowly rolling down into the door panel. A powerful blast of freezing cold air, conditioned air, rolled slowly out from the luxurious cabin, washing over her sweaty face and offering a brief, agonizing glimpse of the comfortable life she had completely thrown away. I sat perfectly still in the spacious leather back seat of the vehicle, enjoying the smooth ride and the quiet comfort of my newly reclaimed peaceful existence. I slowly turned my head to look out the open window, my eyes resting directly on the miserable, disgraced woman standing on the side of the road. I was wearing my favorite dark Chanel sunglasses, shielding my eyes from the harsh afternoon glare, and resting my tired hands comfortably in my lap. In my right hand, I held a tall plastic cup filled with premium iced coffee, the condensation rolling slowly down the sides of the cold cup. The visual contrast between the two of us was absolutely staggering and deeply satisfying to witness. I was dressed in an elegant, lightweight silk blouse, the exact same ivory color as the one she had ruined 6 months ago. My hair was styled perfectly, and I wore a delicate gold necklace that caught the bright sunlight reflecting a warm, glowing radiance inside the dark cabin. I looked effortlessly like a woman who possessed total control over her entire universe, completely unbothered by the petty dramas of greedy people. Chloe, on the other hand, looked like a broken, discarded shell of a human being. Her expensive manicures were long gone, replaced by chipped, broken fingernails and calloused hands hidden inside rough, dirty canvas work gloves. Her posture, which used to be so incredibly arrogant and commanding, was now completely slumped and defeated by the heavy burden of her massive public humiliation. She looked at the cold, iced coffee resting in my hand, and her dry, chapped lips suddenly parted slightly, as if she wanted to beg for a single refreshing sip. I did not offer her any sympathy, and I certainly did not offer her a drink. I wanted her to feel the full, devastating weight of this specific moment. I wanted her to remember the morning she stood in my beautiful kitchen holding a heavy ceramic mug of boiling hot dark roast coffee. I wanted her to remember the vicious sense of entitlement she felt when she hurled that scalding liquid directly at my chest simply because I refused to fund her luxurious spa day completely. She had believed she was an untouchable queen living in a grand castle, but now she was nothing more than a convicted felon picking up dirty, discarded garbage on the side of the street to satisfy a federal mandate. The universe has a remarkably efficient way of balancing the scales of justice, and I was simply the instrument the universe had chosen to use to collect her massive outstanding debt entirely. We stared at each other for a very long time, the heavy silence stretching out between us like a tight wire ready to snap forever. She did not scream at me, and she did not try to run away. She simply stood there completely stripped of her false bravado, drowning in the absolute miserable reality of her own terrible choices. I looked her slowly up and down, taking my time to examine the dirty orange safety vest, the baggy stained denim jeans, and the heavy black plastic garbage bag resting near her heavy work boots. I let my gaze linger on the trash grabber she was holding tight, making sure she understood exactly how far she had fallen from her fabricated throne today. The pure, agonizing shame completely consumed her. Her chin began to tremble violently, and a single tear escaped from the corner of her eye, tracing a clean line down her dirty, sweaty cheek. She finally realized that her extreme arrogance had cost her absolutely everything she ever valued in this world. She had lost her wealthy husband, she had lost her beautiful home, she had lost her freedom, and she had completely lost her dignity forever. I slowly raised my hand and took a long, deliberate sip of my cold, iced coffee. The ice cubes clinked softly against the clear plastic cup, making a crisp, refreshing sound that seemed incredibly loud in the quiet suburban air. I lowered the cup and offered her a very slow, icy smile that did not reach my eyes. I spoke to her with a voice that was perfectly calm, smoothly cutting through the heavy afternoon heat like a sharp surgical blade. I told her that the coffee was absolutely excellent today, but she seemed to strongly prefer the trash. Chloe physically flinched as my words struck her, deeply sinking directly into the very core of her shattered ego. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps trying to apologize or to beg for some small measure of forgiveness, but no sound came out of her dry throat. Before she could muster the strength to utter a single pathetic syllable, I raised my hand and pressed the small silver button on the door panel. The dark-tinted window began to roll up smoothly with a quiet mechanical hum, entirely cutting off her view of my face and physically separating her from my world forever. The window sealed tightly, shutting out the oppressive heat and the pathetic sight of the ruined woman on the side of the street. I signaled my personal driver to continue our journey, and the heavy black Mercedes sport utility vehicle glided seamlessly away from the grassy shoulder, leaving Chloe entirely alone in a cloud of warm dust to finish picking up the dirty garbage she so rightfully deserved. I leaned back against the plush leather headrest, taking another refreshing sip of my iced coffee and closing my eyes as the vehicle navigated toward the private airport terminal. I had completely finished my necessary business in that toxic, affluent suburb, and I was more than ready to begin the next beautiful chapter forever. The scene slowly fades away from the hot, dirty street and transitions smoothly to a breathtaking panoramic view of a vibrant coastal city. The bright turquoise ocean waves crash gently against the pristine white sand beaches, and the tall, modern skyscrapers reach proudly toward the clear blue sky. I am now standing on the expansive private balcony of my brand new luxury penthouse apartment located right in the heart of beautiful sunny Miami. A gentle warm ocean breeze blows softly through my hair as I look out over the magnificent sprawling city below me. I am no longer wearing dark conservative suits or fighting exhausting legal battles in cold formal courtrooms. I am wearing a flowing, colorful silk dress, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, and enjoying the absolute total freedom that comes from completely protecting my own peace and my hard-earned legacy. The past 6 months taught me an incredibly valuable and painful lesson about the true nature of family and the dangerous illusions of unconditional love. People will often try to use biological connections or legal marriage certificates as a convenient excuse to manipulate disrespect and entirely drain you of your vital emotional resources. They will demand your wealth, your time, and your energy, while offering absolutely nothing but empty promises and toxic entitlement in return. I look directly into the camera lens with a completely serene and deeply confident expression, offering my final words of hard-earned wisdom. Blood might make you family, but respect is what keeps you at the table. Never throw coffee on the woman who holds the ledger to your life. Have you ever cut ties to protect your peace? Please do like this video, subscribe, and share your amazing story in the comments section down below right now.